In September 1939, German forces crossed into Poland with over 1 million soldiers, supported by roughly 2,000 tanks and more than 1,000 aircraft. Artillery units fired barrages measured in thousands of shells per day. Mechanized columns advanced along pre-selected axes, designed to fracture defensive lines before reserves could recalibrate. Poland collapsed in weeks, not because its soldiers lacked resolve, but because command cohesion eroded under concentrated armor and air-ground coordination. The method hardened further in the West. By May 1940, Germany fielded over 3 million troops against France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Panzer divisions concentrated armor instead of dispersing it across infantry formations. A single panzer division might deploy more than 200 tanks, each weighing between 20 and 30 tons. Fuel convoys followed closely, delivering hundreds of tons of gasoline daily to sustain advance rates measured in dozens of miles per day. Inside a Panzer IV, rolling through the Ardennes, the engine's vibration traveled through steel plates inches thick. The main gun fired shells weighing over 15 pounds, capable of penetrating opposing armor at combat ranges. Radio sets inside each vehicle allowed commanders to redirect units in real time. That communication advantage fractured slower-moving adversaries who relied on fixed telephone lines and dispatch riders. At Sedan, German forces forced the Meuse River crossing under coordinated artillery and air bombardment. Dive bombers delivered explosives weighing several hundred pounds directly onto defensive positions. French units absorbed the shock, but struggled to concentrate counterattacks. German armored spearheads then drove westward over 200 miles in less than 2 weeks, severing Allied forces that had advanced into Belgium. When I once compared German operational orders from early May 1940 with French defensive planning memoranda written months earlier, I noticed how decisively German planners exploited assumptions about terrain. The Ardennes had been deemed unsuitable for large-scale armored movement. German engineers reinforced bridges, calculated axle loads down to the ton, and moved columns through forest roads that adversaries had discounted. It was not mystical speed, it was prepared movement. Blitzkrieg functioned through concentration and tempo. Aircraft numbering in the hundreds struck rail junctions, airfields, and supply depots. Tanks bypassed strong points, leaving them for infantry to reduce. Encirclements followed. In Poland and France, entire armies were surrounded, with prisoners counted in the hundreds of thousands. At one encirclement near Kiev later in 1941, over 500,000 Soviet soldiers were captured. Yet Blitzkrieg was not invincible. It consumed fuel at rates that strained German supply capacity. A single armored division in sustained operations could require hundreds of tons of fuel per day. Rail conversion in Eastern Europe required ripping up track mile by mile. Trucks broke down under continuous use. Replacement parts lagged behind forward units. The early conquests across Europe, Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, France, Yugoslavia, Greece, created the impression of unstoppable force. Casualty ratios in some early campaigns favored Germany significantly, with certain battles producing losses for opponents that exceeded 30% of engaged forces. German losses were real, but comparatively lower in those opening operations. On the ground, however, Blitzkrieg felt less like abstraction and more like compression. Infantry marched behind armored thrusts, securing towns whose streets were still smoking from artillery fire. Civilians fled in columns stretching miles. Bridges either held under armored weight or collapsed, forcing engineers to build replacements under fire. The technique relied on adversaries failing to adapt quickly. When Germany turned east in June 1941 against the Soviet Union, the scale altered. The front stretched nearly 1,000 miles. Distances to objectives measured in hundreds of miles. Early encirclements repeated success. Yet the deeper German forces advanced, the thinner supply density became. Fuel consumption rose, casualty rates accumulated. Soviet industry relocated and continued production, measured in tens of thousands of tanks annually. Blitzkrieg conquered much of Europe because it concentrated armor, integrated air support, and exploited decision cycles faster than opponents could recalibrate. It fractured static defenses and punished slow communication structures. It relied on radio-equipped armored units operating in coordinated thrusts rather than dispersed penny packets. But the very method that delivered rapid victories required constant supply and manageable distances. Once geography expanded beyond calculated reach, and industrial opponents outpaced German production, the advantages eroded. If you are listening now as the room grows quiet, imagine those early campaigns not as cinematic flashes, but as columns of steel moving steadily across roads, engines humming, radios crackling with clipped commands. The method was systematic. It pressed forward until fuel, resistance, or distance forced it to slow. Let that steady mechanical rhythm ease your thoughts. In the chapters ahead, we will move campaign by campaign: Poland, France, the Balkans, the opening of the Eastern Front, tracing how Blitzkrieg fractured opponents and where its limits emerged. This is the entire history of the Blitzkrieg and how Germany conquered Europe. Chapter 1: The Patent Clerk's War. The 22nd of May, 1927, a small office in Berlin, late afternoon light filtering through windows overlooking the Truppenamt, the deceptively named Troop Office that disguised the German General Staff. Major Heinz Guderian sat at his desk, surrounded by foreign military journals he wasn't supposed to possess. On the wooden surface before him lay a British publication, its pages marked with pencil annotations in German, 3 different handwritings, each officer adding notes to what the previous reader had discovered. The document was JFC Fuller's tactical study from 1918, Plan 1919, a blueprint for mobile armored warfare that had never been tested in combat, because the Great War ended before Fuller's tanks could prove his theory. Guderian ran his finger along a diagram showing coordinated tank penetrations supported by aircraft. Someone before him had written in the margin, in tight script, "Impossible with current cavalry doctrine." What strikes me when I cross-reference Guderian's personnel files with the Reichswehr's motorized transport assignments is how accidental his path to armor truly was. He didn't choose tanks. He was assigned to them in 1922, after Germany's defeat left the army scrambling to preserve some semblance of mobile warfare capability within the strangling restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty limited Germany's army to precisely 100,000 men, banned tanks entirely, and prohibited any research into armored warfare. So the Germans did what any institution does when forbidden from pursuing its core competency. They studied everyone else's work and called it theoretical research. Guderian spent 5 years reading British tank doctrine, French mobile warfare theory, and Soviet mechanization proposals. He studied languages so he could read the original texts. He became, in essence, an academic of a military branch that didn't exist. The theoretical foundation of what would become Blitzkrieg wasn't German at all, it was British. Fuller and Basil Little Hart had published their ideas on deep penetration and the expanding torrent strategy throughout the 1920s, arguing that massed armor coordinated by radio could bypass enemy strongpoints and strike directly at command centers, collapsing armies from within rather than grinding them down from without. The British Army largely ignored both men. Fuller's Plan 1919 called for a mechanized force to penetrate enemy lines and attack headquarters units, paralyzing the German army's ability to coordinate responses. It was brain warfare instead of body warfare, killing the nervous system rather than bleeding out the limbs. The plan was never used, and by the mid-1920s, the British had relegated tanks to infantry support roles. German officers stationed in Sweden on training missions returned with reports of British military journals discussing these radical theories, and the Reichswehr's intelligence department quietly translated everything they could find. In 1929, Guderian was sent to the Soviet Union as part of a secret program that defied every provision of the Versailles Treaty. Near the industrial city of Kazan, roughly 800 kilometers east of Moscow, the Germans and Soviets had established a clandestine tank school, codenamed Kama, a combination of Kazan and the name Malbrandt, the German officer who'd selected the location. The facility operated in complete secrecy from 1929 until 1933, training German officers in armored warfare tactics, using prototype tanks shipped from Germany in pieces and labeled as large tractors to avoid detection. The Soviets provided T-18 light tanks and British Carden-Loyd tankettes for training. German companies, Krupp, Rheinmetall, and Daimler-Benz, built experimental tanks disguised as agricultural equipment and sent them east. It was industrial espionage dressed up as cooperative education. Roughly 250 men trained there in 4 years. Germans learning tank doctrine on Soviet soil, Soviets learning combined arms theory from German instructors. It fascinates me how often this collaboration appears as a footnote in histories of the period, when in fact it was the foundational moment where theory became practice, where British ideas translated through German efficiency met Soviet industrial capability. Guderian observed his first large-scale tank maneuvers at Kama in 1930. He watched as the prototype Großtraktoren, heavy tanks weighing 16 tons and armed with 75mm cannons, maneuvered across the Russian steppes in coordinated formations. He saw immediately what Fuller had theorized. Tanks working alone were vulnerable, slow, and ineffective. But tanks working with motorized infantry, supported by mobile artillery and coordinated through radio communication, could move faster than any cavalry charge and hit harder than any infantry assault. The missing piece was organization. Traditional doctrine distributed tanks among infantry divisions as support weapons, a few vehicles attached to each battalion. Guderian proposed the inverse: create entire divisions built around armor, with every other element, infantry, artillery, engineers, logistics, motorized to keep pace. The tank wasn't a tool to help infantry advance. Infantry was there to protect tanks as they broke through enemy lines. The German High Command resisted. Franz Halder, the Chief of General Staff, told Guderian flatly that infantry would always be the decisive arm in any future conflict. Cavalry officers, still dominant in the Reichswehr despite mechanization's obvious advantages, viewed tanks as novelties at best, mechanical liabilities at worst. Horses didn't break down. Horses didn't require fuel depots or spare parts. Horses were tradition. And so, Guderian wrote papers, taught courses, and waited for someone in authority to listen. In 1937, he published Achtung Panzer, a book that synthesized Fuller's penetration theory, Little Hart's expanding torrent concept, and his own observations from Soviet training into a comprehensive doctrine for armored warfare. The book caught the attention of Adolf Hitler, who saw in Guderian's vision a way to overturn the humiliation of Versailles without the grinding attrition of the Western Front. Hitler didn't understand the technical details. He privately dismissed tanks as useless without infantry during a 1932 demonstration, but he understood speed. He understood surprise. He understood that Germany couldn't win a long war, so it needed to win short ones. Here's where the arithmetic begins to tell a different story than the mythology. Between 1935, when Germany publicly renounced the Versailles Treaty and began open rearmament, and September 1939, when the invasion of Poland began, German factories produced approximately 2,976 tanks. This sounds impressive until you examine the composition. Of those tanks, roughly 1,893 were Panzer I models, machines armed with nothing more than 2 machine guns, protected by armor so thin that Polish anti-tank rifles could penetrate it. Another 1,223 were Panzer II light tanks, with 20mm autocannons, better armed but still inadequate against fortified positions or enemy armor. The Panzer III and Panzer IV, the medium tanks that would become the backbone of German armor divisions, existed in tiny numbers. 98 Panzer III tanks by September 1939, barely enough to equip a single battalion. The vast majority of Germany's armored force on the eve of war consisted of training vehicles pressed into combat service because there was nothing else available. But here's the detail that undermines the entire idea of Blitzkrieg as a meticulously planned revolution in warfare. Of those 2,976 tanks, only 329 had radios capable of coordinating with other units. The rest had either no radio at all or receivers only, meaning they could listen to orders but not communicate back. Guderian's entire tactical philosophy, armored units moving in coordination, responding to changing battlefield conditions in real time, required constant radio contact between tank commanders and their subordinates. The FUG-5 radio system, when it existed, had a maximum range of 2 to 4 kilometers under ideal conditions and required tank commanders to expose themselves in open hatches to operate it effectively. Most Panzer I and Panzer II tanks entered combat in Poland with no capacity for wireless communication beyond hand signals and messenger runners. This is the math that destroys the myth, a doctrine based on coordination deployed with equipment that couldn't coordinate. I find it striking that every English-language history of the period mentions Guderian as the father of Blitzkrieg, but almost none mention Oswald Lutz, his direct superior, and the officer who actually authorized the funding for panzer divisions in 1935. Lutz, a relatively obscure figure now, understood the logistical requirements of mechanized warfare better than any theorist. He knew Germany lacked the industrial base for a sustained armored war. He knew the tanks being produced were inadequate. He knew radio production couldn't scale fast enough. But he also knew that Hitler wanted visible rearmament, and visible rearmament meant tanks rolling through Berlin in propaganda films, whether or not those tanks could actually fight a modern war. The institutional choice was made. Build the panzer divisions with whatever equipment exists, and hope operational momentum compensates for mechanical inadequacy. This wasn't confidence, it was calculated desperation. The final irony sits in an archive box in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg. A single invoice, dated June 1936, billing the Reichswehr precisely 3,740 Reichsmarks for radio equipment to be installed in Panzer I tanks of the 1st Panzer Division. The invoice shows payment for 43 radio sets, 43 radios for a division that fielded over 300 vehicles. The gap between doctrine and reality wasn't subtle. It was documented in procurement records that everyone involved must have read. Blitzkrieg was launched as an idea whose technology hadn't caught up to its theory, a strategic bluff built on borrowed British concepts, tested in secret Soviet facilities, and equipped with radios that didn't exist in sufficient numbers to make the doctrine functional. This is where the story begins, not with triumph in France, but with a middle-aged German officer sitting in an office in Berlin, reading British tank manuals in violation of treaty provisions, sketching out a way of war that his own army couldn't afford to build properly. The doctrine was always a gamble, a bet that speed and surprise could substitute for preparation and equipment, that momentum could mask the mechanical fragility underneath. In 2026 terms, Germany was about to deploy an alpha-release product into a live combat environment, knowing the bugs hadn't been fixed, but betting that the competition would collapse before the flaws became fatal. The first test was 13 years away. The question wasn't whether Blitzkrieg would work. It was how long it would work before the arithmetic caught up to the ambition. The light faded from Guderian's office windows. Outside, Berlin prepared for a war. Its own military doctrine wasn't fully ready to fight. The borrowed ideas sat on the desk, annotated in 3 languages, waiting to be proven or disproven by men who wouldn't know until the shells started falling, whether they'd created a revolution or simply a very fast way to lose. Chapter 2. The Dress Rehearsal Nobody Watched. The 14th of April, 1937, a hangar outside Seville, Spain, where the desert heat turned metal too hot to touch by mid-morning. Inside, a Luftwaffe intelligence analyst named Hauptmann Werner Baumbach sat at a folding table covered in typewritten reports from Condor Legion units, German volunteer forces fighting for Franco's nationalists in the Spanish Civil War. The document on top bore a date from 3 weeks prior and a casualty list that didn't match the official communiques being sent to Berlin. According to propaganda releases, the Condor Legion's Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers were achieving devastating success in close air support missions, terrorizing Republican positions with precision strikes. According to the report Baumbach was reading, Stukas operating over defended positions were sustaining loss rates of approximately 15% per sortie. 15%. In a sustained campaign, that arithmetic meant operational extinction within a week. I'm centering this chapter on the Spanish Civil War, not because of Guernica, that atrocity has been documented exhaustively, but because the after-action reports from Spain specifically warned against the tactics Germany would employ 3 years later in France. The Condor Legion arrived in Spain in November 1936 as a testing ground for equipment and doctrine, a live-fire laboratory where German crews could experiment with combined arms warfare without risking a wider European conflict. What they discovered should have fundamentally altered German tactical planning. What they actually did was ignore the data and proceed anyway. The gap between evidence and institutional response is what fascinates me here. The moment when an organization chooses mythology over mathematics, because admitting the problems would require abandoning the entire strategic framework. The first test of German armored doctrine on Spanish soil occurred on the 16th of November, 1936, near Seville. German advisors supporting nationalist forces attempted a coordinated tank and infantry assault against Republican defensive positions, using tactics derived from Guderian's theories. Concentrated armor pushing through a weak point, supported by dive bombers softening defenses. The attack lasted 40 minutes before collapsing entirely. Republican forces, equipped with Soviet-supplied anti-tank guns and following defensive doctrine developed during the Russian Civil War, simply dug in and waited for the tanks to come within range. The German Panzer I tanks, the same training vehicles being pressed into combat readiness back home, had armor 13 millimeters thick, sufficient to stop rifle bullets, but useless against dedicated anti-tank weapons. Spanish Republican gunners discovered they could penetrate Panzer I armor from the front at ranges exceeding 600 meters. The tanks that survived the initial barrage retreated. The infantry, lacking motorization, couldn't keep pace with the withdrawal. The entire operation devolved into a chaotic rout. Baumbach's reports documented what happened next in clinical detail. From November 1936 through December 1938, the Condor Legion conducted hundreds of combined arms operations across Spain. The archive preserves their findings. Massed armor without adequate infantry support became isolated and vulnerable. Dive bombers operating below 3,000 meters against positions equipped with modern anti-aircraft guns sustained catastrophic losses. Radio coordination between ground and air units broke down repeatedly due to incompatible equipment and undertrained operators. The vaunted lightning war doctrine looked less like revolution and more like expensive chaos. But here's where the institutional blindness becomes visible. Every failed operation was followed by a classified report explaining what went wrong, and every report was filed, catalogued, and ignored. The Battle of Jarama in February 1937 provides the clearest example of doctrine meeting reality and losing. German advisors planned a combined tank and air assault against Republican positions in the Jarama Valley southeast of Madrid. The attack began on the 6th of February, with Heinkel bombers striking Republican trenches, followed by a ground assault featuring approximately 50 tanks, supported by nationalist infantry. The operation was supposed to demonstrate coordinated breakthrough tactics, armor punching through the line, infantry exploiting the gap, aircraft maintaining pressure. Instead, the Republicans used the same defensive measures that had stopped German offensives on the Western Front in 1918. Pre-sighted anti-tank ditches, concealed gun positions, and overlapping fields of fire. The tanks advanced, found themselves channeled into kill zones, and were destroyed methodically. German after-action reports noted that Soviet military advisors, embedded with Republican forces, had taught them defense-in-depth tactics, specifically designed to counter mechanized assault. The lesson was unambiguous. A determined defender with adequate anti-tank weapons could stop armored penetrations cold. The Stuka dive bomber became the Condor Legion's most troubling problem, and this is where source conflicts reveal institutional deception. Nazi propaganda films from Spain show Ju-87s screaming down on Republican positions, sirens wailing, bombs obliterating targets with terrifying precision. These clips were shown in German cinemas and distributed internationally as proof of Luftwaffe superiority. Meanwhile, classified Condor Legion casualty logs tell a different story entirely. Between April 1937 and November 1938, Stukas flying close air support missions over defended areas sustained average loss rates of 72% across the entire deployment. 72%. Not 72% casualties. 72% of aircraft lost or damaged to the point of being non-operational. The Stuka's fixed landing gear, deliberately designed to reduce weight and complexity, created aerodynamic drag that limited top speed to approximately 380 kilometers per hour. Any modern fighter, and Republican forces had Soviet-supplied I-16 fighters capable of 450 kilometers per hour, could catch a Stuka in level flight and destroy it before the pilot could react. In April 1937, Wolfram von Richthofen, cousin of the famous Red Baron and commander of the Condor Legion's aerial forces, sent a telegram to Luftwaffe headquarters in Berlin. The message was brief and unequivocal. Stukas are coffins against modern fighters. Recommend abandonment of dive bomber doctrine for any conflict involving enemy air superiority. The telegram is preserved in the Bundesarchive, stamped with a date and a routing code. It was read by senior Luftwaffe commanders. It was filed. It was never acted upon. Production of Ju-87 Stukas continued at accelerating rates through 1939, 1940, and into 1941, by which time the aircraft's vulnerabilities had been demonstrated repeatedly in actual combat over France and Britain. The question isn't whether German leadership knew the Stuka was inadequate. They had empirical proof from Spain. The question is why they ignored the proof. What haunts me is that someone read these reports and chose victory propaganda over tactical reform. This wasn't ignorance, it was institutional momentum overriding evidence. The Condor Legion's final operational debrief, submitted in December 1938 after Franco's victory, ran to 370 pages and included specific recommendations for German rearmament. Among the findings, discontinue reliance on light tanks in favor of heavier, better-armed vehicles. Abandon dive bomber doctrine against modern air defenses. Expand radio production to ensure every armored vehicle has communication capability. Develop dedicated anti-tank weapons for infantry units. Increase motorization of support elements to prevent breakthrough units from outrunning their supply lines. These weren't vague suggestions. They were engineering specifications backed by casualty data and operational analysis. The recommendations were distributed to relevant Wehrmacht departments. Production priorities didn't change. Spain also revealed the conceptual flaw at Blitzkrieg's core. It assumed the enemy would behave in specific ways. Armored breakthrough required the enemy to maintain rigid defensive lines that could be penetrated at weak points. Close air support required the enemy to lack effective anti-aircraft defenses or fighter cover. Rapid exploitation required the enemy to have centralized command structures that would collapse when disrupted. Republican forces in Spain, advised by Soviet military theorists who'd been developing counter-mechanization tactics since the late 1920s, simply didn't cooperate with these assumptions. They used mobile reserves instead of static lines. They dispersed anti-aircraft guns rather than concentrating them. They maintained decentralized command so that local commanders could respond to breakthroughs without waiting for orders from distant headquarters. In short, they developed the anti-Blitzkrieg playbook, and it worked. Here's a number that destroys the narrative of Spanish Civil War as a triumph of German tactical innovation. 11,250 tons of ammunition expended by Condor Legion artillery and air forces to destroy Republican fortifications, that 450 tons of conventional explosives and infantry assault had breached incomparable First World War operations. The ratio reveals diminishing returns, more firepower producing less result. The promised efficiency of mechanized warfare wasn't materializing. Instead, Germany was learning that modern defenses could absorb enormous punishment and remain functional. This should have terrified German planners, because it suggested that any future war against a well-prepared enemy would devolve into exactly the kind of attritional slugging match that Germany couldn't afford. The lesson from Spain was clear. Blitzkrieg works brilliantly against incompetent opposition and fails catastrophically against competent defenders. Soviet advisors in Spain were taking notes too. Men like Mikhail Tukhachevsky and Semyon Krivoshein, both of whom had trained alongside Germans at the Kama tank school in the 1920s, observed Condor Legion operations with professional interest. They saw German tanks isolated and destroyed. They saw dive bombers shot down in clusters. They cataloged every tactical mistake and every mechanical failure. The knowledge they gained in Spain would inform Soviet defensive doctrine for the next decade, creating the operational frameworks that would devastate German armored offensives at Kursk in 1943 and throughout the Bagration offensive in 1944. Spain didn't just fail to teach Germany the right lessons. It taught the Soviet Union exactly how to defeat German tactics. The final Condor Legion report, submitted in January 1939, contained a single recommendation that was stamped irrelevant in red ink across the title page. The recommendation proposed a complete overhaul of German combined arms doctrine to account for modern anti-tank and anti-aircraft defenses. It suggested that the next European war would require heavier tanks, more robust logistics, and abandonment of the assumption that speed could substitute for protection. The report was written by officers who'd watched their theories fail in practice, who'd seen friends die in aircraft that couldn't defend themselves and tanks that couldn't penetrate enemy defenses. Their evidence was dismissed because the institutional apparatus had already committed to a strategic framework that couldn't accommodate doubt. Germany had invested too much in Blitzkrieg to admit that the dress rehearsal had revealed fundamental problems. By 1939, when the Condor Legion returned to Germany, its veterans had combat experience that should have been invaluable. They'd tested German equipment in actual battle. They'd faced modern defenses. They'd identified specific weaknesses that needed correction before any major European conflict. Instead, their warnings were treated as isolated incidents, anomalies that wouldn't repeat against real opposition. The propaganda machine had already declared Spain a triumph. Newsreels showed German tanks rolling through captured cities. Radio broadcasts described precision Stuka strikes. The domestic audience saw victory. The veterans saw the casualty lists and wondered why no one was listening. In 2026 terms, Spain was the beta test that revealed critical failures before product launch, and the development team chose to ship anyway because the release date was locked in. The organizational pathology is familiar to anyone who's watched a company ignore testing data because acknowledging problems would mean missing quarterly targets. Germany had scheduled its war. The equipment wasn't ready, the tactics had been proven inadequate, and none of that mattered because the institutional momentum toward conflict had achieved a velocity that evidence couldn't slow. The afternoon light in that Seville hangar faded. Baumbach stacked his reports, flagged the critical sections, and prepared his summary for Berlin. He'd done his job, documented the failures, quantified the losses, recommended corrections. Whether anyone would read it, whether anyone would care, was beyond his control. The war machine had its own logic now, and that logic didn't accommodate the possibility that the revolution might be a mirage, that the lightning war might just be regular war, conducted recklessly. The reports went into the archive. The Stukas stayed in production. The doctrine remained unchanged. Spain had spoken, and Germany had chosen not to listen. Chapter 3. Case White, The Calculator's Invasion. The 1st of September, 1939, 04:45 hours. A supply depot 30 kilometers inside the German-Polish border, where a quartermaster named Hauptmann Klaus Dietrich stood in a warehouse counting fuel drums. Outside, the invasion of Poland had begun 45 minutes earlier, with artillery barrages and Luftwaffe strikes against Polish airfields. Inside, Dietrich was performing arithmetic that would determine whether Heinz Guderian's 19th Corps could continue its advance in 72 hours. Each drum contained 200 liters of gasoline. Each Panzer III tank consumed approximately 150 liters per 100 kilometers of operation. Guderian's corps had roughly 240 armored vehicles of various types. The math was straightforward and unforgiving. At current consumption rates, with no resupply from Germany, 19th Corps would run dry in 4 days. Dietrich noted this in his log with the detached precision of a man who understood that wars are fought on statistics, not slogans. I'm using Poland not as a narrative triumph, but as a statistical near disaster, because the logistical documents reveal a different story than the propaganda films. The lightning victory that shocked the world and validated Blitzkrieg doctrine was, according to German Army High Command's own supply records, approximately 72 hours away from operational collapse at multiple points during the campaign. The invasion succeeded not because German doctrine was superior, but because Polish strategic errors and catastrophic coordination failures provided exactly the conditions Blitzkrieg required to function. Poland was conquered by Polish mistakes and German luck, disguised as German genius. The invasion began with mechanical failure on an almost comical scale. German armored units crossed the border at dawn, and within 6 hours, 62 tanks had broken down. 62 tanks, representing roughly 4% of the entire armored force committed to the operation, immobilized not by enemy action, but by transmission failures, engine seizures, and track separations. The Panzer I and Panzer II light tanks, that comprised approximately 70% of German armor, were mechanically fragile machines built for training, not sustained combat operations. Their Maybach engines, adequate for parade ground maneuvers in Germany, overheated in extended high-speed running. Their transmissions, designed for careful shifting by trained operators, stripped gears when rushed. Their tracks, rated for perhaps 300 kilometers of service life under optimal conditions, began shedding drive links almost immediately on Polish roads. Unit maintenance logs from the 1st and 4th Panzer Divisions record emergency repair stops every 40 to 60 kilometers during the first 3 days of the campaign. Here's where Guderian's memoirs diverge sharply from the regimental war diaries, and I'm compelled to trust the contemporary records over the post-war reminiscences. In Panzerleader, published in 1952, Guderian describes the Polish campaign as a lightning advance, where his corps raced across Poland with minimal resistance, reaching the Vistula River in 5 days through operational brilliance. The actual war diaries from units under his command tell a different story. 19th Corps halted for fuel shortages 47 times in the first week. 47 times. These weren't tactical pauses. They were emergency stops where units simply ran out of gasoline and had to wait hours for supply columns to catch up. The lightning advance moved at roughly 40 kilometers per day when averaged across the campaign, barely faster than infantry marching speed. The difference between memoir and record is the difference between what leaders wanted to believe happened and what actually happened. The Battle of Bzura, fought between the 9th and 19th of September, nearly destroyed the entire invasion plan and gets misrepresented in almost every popular history. Polish forces, rather than collapsing as German doctrine assumed they would, concentrated approximately 7 divisions and launched a counterattack against German positions along the Bzura River, west of Warsaw. This was exactly the kind of mobile, aggressive response that Blitzkrieg doctrine wasn't designed to handle. The theory assumed breakthroughs would create chaos and paralysis. Instead, Polish commanders maintained cohesion and struck at German supply lines connecting forward armor units to rear echelons. For 3 days, the outcome was genuinely uncertain. German ground forces, their tanks spread across hundreds of kilometers, and many units critically low on fuel and ammunition, couldn't concentrate enough strength to contain the counterattack. What stopped the Polish offensive wasn't German armored prowess, it was the Luftwaffe. Between the 9th and 12th of September, German aircraft flew approximately 4,000 sorties against Polish units around Bzura, dropping roughly 2,800 tons of bombs and strafing columns with machine gun fire. This was interdiction on a massive scale, and it worked because Polish forces lacked effective anti-aircraft defenses and couldn't contest German air superiority. But here's the critical detail that undermines the Blitzkrieg narrative. The Luftwaffe succeeded in Poland because the Polish Air Force had been destroyed on the ground in the first 48 hours of the war. German air superiority wasn't achieved through superior tactics or training. It was achieved through surprise attacks on peacetime airfields before Polish pilots could scramble. The lesson Poland seemed to teach was that air power could substitute for armored coordination. The actual lesson was that air power worked against an enemy who couldn't fight back. On the 17th of September, when Soviet forces invaded Poland from the east, per the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Polish defensive coordination collapsed entirely. This is the event that ended Polish resistance, not German operational art. Polish units that had been fighting effectively against German forces suddenly faced a two-front war with no strategic depth and no possibility of retreat. The speed of Poland's surrender had less to do with Blitzkrieg effectiveness and more to do with being invaded simultaneously by 2 major powers. The arithmetic was impossible. Roughly 1 million Polish soldiers facing over 1 million Germans from the west, and roughly 450,000 Soviets from the east. Poland didn't fall to lightning war. It fell to being caught in a vice. Warsaw held out until the 27th of September, and its fall reveals the gap between Blitzkrieg theory and practice. According to doctrine, German armor should have encircled the city, cut it off from supplies, and forced surrender through maneuver. Instead, Warsaw was reduced by conventional siege warfare, artillery bombardment, aerial bombing, and infantry assault. The city didn't fall to tanks. It fell to sustained firepower and eventual starvation. German forces fired approximately 30,000 artillery shells into Warsaw over 3 weeks, and the Luftwaffe dropped roughly 560 tons of bombs. This was attrition warfare, the exact kind of grinding, costly combat that Blitzkrieg was supposed to make obsolete. The final assault on the city involved infantry street fighting, building-by-building clearance, and casualty rates that appalled German commanders. Maneuver hadn't won Warsaw. Weight of fire had won Warsaw. Now the numbers that destroy the mythology entirely. Germany deployed approximately 2,750 tanks to Poland. This sounds like mechanized dominance until you examine what was actually deployed. Roughly 1,500 were Panzer I tanks, armed only with machine guns, useless against fortifications or enemy armor. Another 1,000 were Panzer II light tanks, with 20mm autocannons, better armed but still inadequate for sustained combat. Fewer than 300 were Panzer III and Panzer IV medium tanks, with legitimate anti-tank capability. The vast majority of German armored might consisted of training vehicles that Polish anti-tank rifles could penetrate from the front at combat ranges. Polish 37mm anti-tank guns destroyed German tanks at an embarrassing rate during the few engagements where Polish forces had time to prepare defensive positions. But here's the statistic that makes me question whether Blitzkrieg was ever a revolution in warfare, or simply a faster way to conduct conventional operations. Germany employed 217,000 horses during the invasion of Poland. 217,000 horses versus 2,750 tanks. The vast majority of German logistics, artillery movement, and supply transportation depended on animal power, not mechanization. The Wehrmacht in September 1939 was fundamentally a horse-drawn army with a small mechanized spearhead. The panzers got the newsreel footage, but horses carried the ammunition. This wasn't a new way of war. It was the old way of war conducted at slightly higher speed by a small percentage of the force. German casualties in Poland totaled approximately 16,000 killed over 35 days of combat. To put this in context, during comparable periods of First World War offensives, German casualties frequently exceeded 16,000 per week. So yes, Poland was cheaper in lives than typical Great War battles. But it wasn't cheap. 16,000 dead in 5 weeks, against an enemy that was strategically doomed from the start, operationally unprepared, and simultaneously invaded by a second major power. This doesn't suggest revolutionary efficiency. It suggests that killing people, even with mechanized warfare, remains expensive. The technical breakdowns continued throughout the campaign, at rates that should have alarmed German commanders. By mid-September, roughly 40% of German armor was either destroyed, damaged, or mechanically non-functional. Tank recovery units worked around the clock, retrieving broken-down vehicles from roads where they'd been abandoned when their transmissions failed or their engines seized. A photograph exists in the Bundesarchiv, catalogued but rarely published, showing a column of 17 Panzer II tanks abandoned on a roadside south of Warsaw on the 17th of September. They hadn't been destroyed by enemy fire. They'd simply run out of spare parts. The caption notes they were eventually recovered and returned to service after the campaign ended. But during the critical phase of operations, they were useless metal. I keep returning to this question. If Polish High Command had not ordered its forces to concentrate in western Poland within range of German armor, would Blitzkrieg have failed by the 8th day? Polish strategic doctrine called for a forward defense, positioning the bulk of Polish forces near the German border to protect industrial regions. This decision put Polish troops exactly where German armored spearheads could encircle them. If Poland had instead traded space for time, conducting a fighting withdrawal to the Vistula River line, and forcing Germany to extend its supply lines across 300 kilometers, German fuel shortages and mechanical breakdowns might have stalled the invasion entirely. The operational arithmetic was that precarious. Blitzkrieg in Poland succeeded because Poland gave Germany the exact conditions the doctrine required. A forward-deployed enemy, centralized command vulnerable to disruption, and strategic inflexibility. The invasion ended on the 6th of October with Poland partitioned between Germany and the Soviet Union. Berlin declared a great victory. Newsreels showed endless columns of panzers and smiling soldiers. The propaganda machine proclaimed that a new era of warfare had begun. Meanwhile, German quartermasters compiled reports showing that ammunition expenditure had exceeded pre-war estimates by 40%, fuel consumption by 60%, and vehicle attrition by 70%. These weren't sustainable rates for a prolonged campaign. Poland had been conquered in 5 weeks, but the German military had consumed resources at a pace that couldn't be maintained for 5 months. In 2026 terms, Poland was the product launch where every beta test failure occurred, but the customer didn't notice because the competing product was so spectacularly worse. Germany's mechanical fragility, logistical inadequacy, and doctrinal brittleness were masked by Polish strategic incompetence. The validation of Blitzkrieg was really just proof that a flawed doctrine could succeed against an opponent who made even more fundamental mistakes. The question no one in German high command seemed to ask was, what happens when we face an enemy who doesn't cooperate with our requirements? The warehouse where Hauptmann Dietrich counted fuel drums was empty now, its contents dispersed to units across Poland. His arithmetic had been correct. The fuel ran short. The invasion succeeded anyway because Polish resistance collapsed before German logistics did. But the margin was thin, far thinner than the victory parade suggested. The calculators knew this. The quartermasters knew this. The men who had to count drums and track kilometers and calculate consumption rates knew that Poland had been won not by superiority, but by arriving slightly less unprepared than the opposition. The war was 3 weeks old, and Germany had already proven that its revolutionary doctrine required extraordinary luck to function at all. Chapter 4. The Mechelen Incident, the Plan on the Train. The 10th of January 1940, 11:30 in the morning. A Belgian military intelligence office in Mechelen aan de Maas, where Major Joseph Maschlein stood over a table, examining documents that had arrived under circumstances so improbable they seemed fictional. Spread across the wooden surface were scorched but legible German operational maps, planning documents, and movement orders, the complete operational plan for Germany's invasion of Belgium and France, captured when a Luftwaffe plane carrying Major Helmuth Rheinberger had crash-landed in Belgium that morning. Rheinberger had attempted to burn the documents after the crash, but had only partially succeeded. What remained was enough for Belgian intelligence to reconstruct German intentions in extraordinary detail. Maschlein stared at the maps and felt a creeping sense of dread, not because of what the Germans planned to do, but because of what the documents revealed about German assumptions. What fascinates me about the Mechelen incident is that it proves Germany was about to launch a conventional, predictable invasion that looked almost identical to the Schlieffen Plan from 1914. The captured documents showed the bulk of German forces attacking through central Belgium, bypassing the Maginot Line fortifications by going around them to the north. Exactly what France and Britain expected Germany to do. There was no mention of the Ardennes forest, no indication of armored forces massing for a thrust through terrain considered impassable for tanks. The plan Belgium captured was Fall Gelb, case yellow, and it was conventional warfare writ large. What Belgium didn't know, what German commanders themselves didn't know yet, was that this plan was about to be scrapped in panic and replaced with something far more desperate. The crash occurred because of weather. Rheinberger, a Luftwaffe major assigned to the 7th Air Division, was carrying the operational documents to a planning conference in Cologne. He'd hitched a ride with a fellow officer who owned a private plane, hoping to save time. The flight ran into fog over the Belgian border. The pilot became disoriented, and they made an emergency landing in a field near Mechelen. Belgian border guards arrived within minutes. Rheinberger tried to burn the documents using the plane's lighter, but damp paper resists quick combustion. The guards extinguished the fire and confiscated everything. Within hours, the documents were in Belgian military intelligence hands. Within 24 hours, copies were being shared with French and British military attachés. Belgian King Leopold III's diary entries from mid-January 1940 confirmed the documents were genuine. Belgian intelligence cross-referenced the captured plans with observed German troop concentrations along the border and found they matched exactly. The Germans weren't running a deception operation. They'd accidentally handed their enemy the complete invasion blueprint. This should have been catastrophic for German planning. Instead, it became the catalyst that created the Ardennes offensive and, inadvertently, the invasion plan that would actually succeed. Here's where the source conflict becomes important. After the war, German high command claimed the Mechelen documents were intentionally incomplete, partial decoys designed to mislead the Allies, while the real plan was developed in secret. This is provably false. Internal OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, Armed Forces High Command, memoranda from January 1940 show panic, not strategic deception. Generals Halder and Braukitsch demanded an immediate assessment of whether Fall Gelb was still viable after the breach. Hitler, furious at the security failure, ordered a complete operational review. The debate that followed wasn't about exploiting Allied knowledge of a false plan. It was about whether to cancel the invasion entirely. Erich von Manstein, at the time Chief of Staff to Army Group A, and a persistent advocate for alternative operational approaches, had been proposing a different invasion route since October 1939. His plan, eventually codenamed Sickelschnitt, sickle cut, called for a massive armored thrust through the Ardennes forest in southern Belgium and Luxembourg, crossing the Meuse River near Sedan, and driving west to the English Channel, cutting off Allied forces that had moved into Belgium to counter the expected German attack there. The plan was risky to the point of recklessness. The Ardennes roads were narrow, winding forest tracks rated for light civilian traffic, not the hundreds of thousands of tons that a major armored offensive would require moving. French military doctrine considered the Ardennes impassable for large-scale armored operations. Manstein had presented his plan to OKW 7 times between October 1939 and January 1940. 7 times it had been rejected as too risky, too dependent on perfect timing, and too vulnerable to disaster if French forces detected the movement and counterattacked during the vulnerable Meuse crossing phase. But after Mechelen, after the Allies knew the conventional plan, Manstein's alternative suddenly looked like the only option. In February 1940, Hitler met with Manstein personally, listened to the presentation, and approved the revised plan. Germany was going to attack through the Ardennes, not because it was brilliant strategy, but because the original strategy had leaked and they needed something, anything, that the Allies weren't prepared for. The logistical problems were immediately apparent to German quartermasters. The Ardennes forest road network consisted of narrow routes through heavily wooded terrain with limited capacity for traffic. German logistics officers calculated that moving Army Group A, roughly 134,000 vehicles, including tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and supply wagons, through the Ardennes, would require those roads to handle approximately 18,000 tons of equipment per day. The roads were rated for 4,000 tons per day under optimal conditions. This created a 4 times overload factor, meaning that even under perfect conditions with no enemy interference, German columns would create massive traffic jams that could take days to untangle. And if French or Belgian forces managed to destroy even a single bridge or create a roadblock at a critical choke point, the entire offensive could stall, with half the army trapped on forest roads with nowhere to go. Tank column spacing requirements made this worse. German armored doctrine, based on lessons from Poland, required maintaining 50 meters between vehicles to prevent chain reaction crashes and to allow maneuvering around breakdowns. At 50-meter spacing, a single panzer division stretched across approximately 30 kilometers of road. Army Group A was moving 7 panzer divisions plus motorized infantry, artillery, and support units through a road network where the longest uninterrupted route was perhaps 60 kilometers. The math predicted a traffic jam extending well over 100 miles, with vehicles stacked bumper to bumper through forests where Allied air reconnaissance could spot them easily, and Allied artillery could destroy them without opposition. On the 4th of February, 1940, German engineers submitted a study of the Meuse River crossing requirements near Sedan. The river at Sedan averaged 120 meters wide and 3 to 4 meters deep, fordable for infantry, but requiring pontoon bridges for vehicles and armor. Each pontoon bridge section weighed approximately 800 kilograms and required assembly under ideal conditions by trained engineer units. German planning called for constructing multiple bridges under combat conditions, while under enemy artillery fire. The study calculated that even with no enemy interference, bridge construction would require a minimum of 6 hours. With French artillery firing on the crossing sites, the estimate rose to 12 to 18 hours. During that period, German forces on the western bank would be isolated, unsupported, and vulnerable to French armored counterattack. French intelligence received Belgian warnings about a possible Ardennes offensive in March 1940. This is documented in French military archives. Belgian intelligence, having seen the original captured plans, noted the absence of significant German forces near the Ardennes border, and concluded Germany might be massing there instead. They shared this assessment with French high command. French generals dismissed the warning as impractical. The Ardennes, they argued, were impassable for armor. The assertion wasn't based on wishful thinking. It was based on French military exercises in the 1930s that had attempted to move armored forces through the Ardennes and concluded it couldn't be done quickly enough to achieve operational surprise. The French were applying their own competence standards to German planning and assuming Germans wouldn't attempt something French doctrine deemed impossible. What if Rheinberger had successfully burned those documents? The question is more than historical speculation. It's a thought experiment about institutional momentum and strategic inflexibility. If the Mechelen incident hadn't occurred, Germany would likely have proceeded with Fall Gelb, the conventional plan, sometime in spring 1940. Allied forces, positioned to meet a German attack through central Belgium, would have faced exactly the attack they expected. The result would have been grinding, attritional warfare reminiscent of the First World War's Western Front, precisely the kind of prolonged conflict Germany couldn't afford, and that Blitzkrieg was designed to avoid. The Ardennes offensive only happened because desperation forced innovation. The masterstroke that conquered France was a backup plan, adopted after the primary plan leaked. The revised operational maps from March 1940 show the problem visually. German attack arrows converge on the Ardennes from multiple directions, all trying to funnel through the same narrow road network at the same time. Logistics officers drew circles around potential bottleneck points, places where single destroyed bridges or blocked roads could paralyze entire divisions. There were 14 such critical points on the route to Sedan, 14 places where Allied action or German mechanical failure could turn the offensive into a disaster. The plan required all 14 points to remain open and functional simultaneously for 5 consecutive days. The probability calculations were grim. Even assuming a 95% chance of success at each choke point, compound probability put overall mission success at roughly 50%. This wasn't a sure thing, this was a coin flip. Manstein's plan also assumed French forces would respond slowly and conventionally to the breakthrough once it occurred. German intelligence assessments predicted that French armored reserves, once committed, would take 48 to 72 hours to concentrate for a counterattack. This assumption was critical because German armor, after crossing the Meuse, would be advancing with extended supply lines through terrain where a major French armored thrust from the south could cut them off entirely. If French reserves moved faster than German intelligence predicted, Army Group A could find itself surrounded and destroyed in detail. The entire operation balanced on France behaving exactly as German planning required them to behave. In 2026 terms, the Mechelen incident is like a major data breach forcing a company to completely redesign its product architecture 60 days before launch. The new design is technically superior in some ways, but hasn't been tested, introduces massive new failure points, and requires perfect execution of a process never attempted at scale. The organization proceeds because the alternative, canceling the launch after the previous design leaked, would be an admission of total failure. So they gamble on the redesign, knowing the odds are worse than 50-50, hoping that speed and surprise can compensate for inadequate preparation. By April 1940, German forces were positioned for the revised offensive. The conventional attack through central Belgium would serve as a feint, drawing Allied forces north and away from the real threat. The Ardennes assault would be the actual main effort, though even German commanders privately questioned whether it could work. The quartermaster reports were pessimistic. The logistics assessments were worse. The engineering studies highlighted a dozen ways the operation could fail catastrophically. But the invasion date was set, and momentum had replaced analysis. The winter fog that forced Rheinberger's plane down over Belgium had changed the war before the war even started. A document that was supposed to ensure German victory instead guaranteed a different kind of invasion entirely, one more desperate, more dependent on luck, and more vulnerable to catastrophe than the plan it replaced. Whether this made German chances better or worse, no one really knew. They'd find out in May. The archives preserve the uncertainty, the calculations that didn't quite add up, the logistics that didn't quite work on paper. History records what happened next, but the documents from spring 1940 record what was supposed to happen, and those two things weren't the same at all. The maps sat on Belgian intelligence tables through winter, proof that Germany's plans could be known, studied, and countered. What no one anticipated was that knowing the wrong plan might be worse than knowing nothing, that confidence based on faulty intelligence was more dangerous than uncertainty. The documents burned incompletely in a Belgian field had set in motion a chain of reactions that would redraw European borders within 2 months. And it all started with bad weather, an unauthorized flight, and papers that refused to burn fast enough. Chapter 5. Sedan, the 57 hours. The 13th of May, 1940, 14:22 hours. An engineering officer named Hauptmann Friedrich Siebel crouched at the western bank of the Meuse River near Sedan, recording measurements in a waterproof notebook, while French artillery shells exploded in the water 30 meters away. The assignment was absurd, but necessary. Determine if the partially constructed pontoon bridge could support the weight of a Panzer III medium tank without collapsing. The bridge sections, assembled under continuous fire, were designed for load capacities based on engineering manuals and manufacturer specifications. But nobody had ever tested them with 19.5-ton tanks crossing, while artillery shells cratered the riverbed and sent shockwaves through the water. Siebel wrote in his notes, "Bridge load capacity unknown. Colonel orders crossing anyway. 1st Panzer III, 19.5 tons." The notation captures everything about Sedan: improvisation under fire, calculations made with insufficient data, and orders to proceed despite uncertainty. I'm structuring this as a minute-by-minute breakdown of May 13th through 15th to show that Sedan, the masterpiece of Blitzkrieg, was improvisational chaos, barely contained by desperate competence. This wasn't orchestrated maneuver, it was controlled panic, where German forces stumbled forward because French command paralysis created an operational vacuum. The breakthrough happened, absolutely, but the 57 hours from assault initiation to exploitation phase reveal how thin the margin between victory and disaster actually was. The operation began at 0700 hours on May 13th, with a Luftwaffe bombardment that established metrics for saturation aerial attack. For 8 continuous hours, German aircraft, primarily Heinkel He-111 bombers and Junkers Ju-87 Stukas, flew approximately 1,500 sorties against a 6-mile front around Sedan. They dropped approximately 4,762 tons of explosives on French defensive positions, communication trenches, artillery emplacements, and reserve staging areas. To contextualize this number, it exceeded the total Luftwaffe bomb tonnage dropped on Britain during the entire month of September 1940 during the Battle of Britain. 4,700 tons on a 6-mile front. The arithmetic translates to roughly 794 tons per mile, or approximately 150 kilograms of high explosive per linear meter of front line. The bombardment's purpose wasn't destruction, it was suppression. German intelligence knew that French bunkers, built with reinforced concrete following First World War defensive principles, couldn't be destroyed by aerial bombing alone. The bombs weren't heavy enough and lacked the penetration capacity needed to breach hardened structures. Instead, the goal was psychological: keep French defenders trapped underground, unable to man weapons, unable to observe German movements, unable to coordinate defensive fires. For 8 hours, French units along the Meuse endured continuous explosion concussion, dust, noise, and the complete inability to communicate with adjacent units or higher command. Radio antennas were destroyed, telephone lines were cut, runners couldn't move above ground without being killed. The bombardment didn't kill the French defenses, it paralyzed them. At 1600 hours, the first wave of German infantry assault forces crossed the Meuse River in rubber boats. These weren't armored forces. Armor couldn't cross water. These were infantry engineers from the 1st and 10th Panzer Division reconnaissance battalions, plus Grossdeutschland Regiment assault troops, each boat carrying roughly 10 men with light weapons. The crossing was supposed to be coordinated and methodical. Instead, it was a race. Units launched wherever they could find cover, paddling frantically across a river roughly 120 meters wide, while French machine guns and artillery, still operational despite the bombardment, opened fire from surviving positions. Casualty rates in the first wave were approximately 38%. 38% casualties before reaching the opposite bank. This wasn't clean breakthrough. This was World War I-style infantry assault with all the expected bloodshed. German forces reached the western bank and discovered that French bunker defenses, while suppressed, weren't destroyed. Individual strong points remained operational, their crews emerging from underground shelters to find German infantry already bypassing their positions. The tactical situation devolved into close-quarters combat. Grenades, small arms fire, and assault teams systematically clearing bunkers one at a time. This wasn't the war of maneuver that Blitzkrieg promised. It was building-to-building fighting, translated to river fortifications. Progress was measured in meters. By 1800 hours, roughly 6 hours after the bombing began, German forces had secured approximately 300 meters of riverbank and were fighting for every additional meter. The bridgehead existed, barely, but it wasn't enough to bring armor across. The night of May 13th through 14th was when German engineering units attempted to construct pontoon bridges while under sporadic French artillery fire. This is where Siebel's measurements become critical. German engineers had prefabricated pontoon sections, but assembling them in combat conditions proved far more difficult than peacetime training exercises suggested. Each section weighed several hundred kilograms and required precise alignment with adjacent sections to create a stable bridge. Work crews operated under blackout conditions to avoid French artillery observation, using only shielded lanterns to see what they were doing. The first bridge section collapsed during assembly when a French artillery shell exploded close enough to create a concussion wave that separated the sections. Engineers had to begin again. By 0330 hours on May 14th, the first functional pontoon bridge was completed and tested with a light vehicle. It held. At 0415, a Panzer III attempted to cross. Siebel watched from the eastern bank as the tank rolled onto the bridge approaches, its weight immediately settling the pontoons deeper into the water than expected. The bridge flexed, but held. The tank made it halfway across, approximately 60 meters, when French artillery found the range. The shell landed in the river 20 meters upstream, sending a wall of water across the bridge and momentarily obscuring everything. When visibility cleared, the tank was still moving. The bridge was damaged but intact, and German engineers were already wading into the river to repair the pontoon sections that had separated from the impact. The Panzer III reached the western bank. Crossing time, 4 minutes. Distance, 120 meters. If the crossing had to be completed under sustained French artillery fire, German armor would have been destroyed section by section as they waited in line to cross a bridge that could only handle one vehicle at a time. But French artillery didn't sustain fire. Here's where French command paralysis becomes the critical variable. French defensive doctrine called for mobile reserves to counterattack any breakthrough before it could be exploited. In the Sedan sector, French forces had approximately 70 medium tanks positioned within striking distance of the bridgehead. These could have attacked at dawn on May 14th and potentially destroyed German forces before significant armor crossed the river. Instead, French command spent 14 hours requesting clarification of orders, attempting to confirm reports, and coordinating between multiple command echelons. By the time French armor moved, it was approaching noon on May 14th, and German forces had been reinforcing the bridgehead for 12 hours. The French counterattack, when it finally came at approximately 0900 hours on May 15th, was uncoordinated and piecemeal. French armor attacked with approximately 70 tanks, but without adequate infantry support. The same mistake German doctrine specifically warned against based on Spanish Civil War lessons. German anti-tank guns, positioned in the bridgehead overnight, engaged French tanks at ranges where French armor couldn't effectively return fire. The French attack failed, not because German defenses were overwhelmingly strong, but because French coordination was catastrophically weak. Tanks advanced without infantry to suppress anti-tank positions. Infantry advanced without tanks to provide breakthrough power. Artillery fired without effective observation. The attack collapsed in roughly 3 hours, with French forces losing approximately 40 tanks and retreating to defensive positions. By May 15th, at 0900 hours, German forces had approximately 40 functional pontoon bridges across the Meuse in the Sedan sector, and were pouring armor westward through the breach. This is when Guderian's famous reconnaissance in force occurred. His authorization to advance exceeded his orders, but his units were already moving, and stopping them would have been more difficult than allowing them to continue. The breakthrough had succeeded, but examining the timeline reveals how contingent success actually was. If the Luftwaffe bombardment had been less effective, French defenders would have contested the initial crossing more heavily. If French artillery had maintained sustained fire on the crossing sites, pontoon bridge construction would have been impossible. If French reserves had counterattacked at dawn on May 14th, instead of mid-morning on May 15th, they might have destroyed the bridgehead before German reinforcements arrived. The window for success was approximately 6 hours on the night of May 13th through early morning May 14th. During that period, French forces had the opportunity to destroy isolated German infantry positions on the western bank before bridges were completed. They didn't act, not because German defenses were impregnable, but but because French command couldn't make decisions fast enough to exploit fleeting opportunities. The paralysis wasn't technological, it was institutional. French generals waited for complete information before acting, and in mobile warfare, complete information arrives after the critical moment has passed. I cannot escape the conclusion that if French artillery had fired for 15 more minutes during the crucial bridge construction phase, the entire bridgehead collapses. That's how thin the margin was. Not 15 hours, 15 minutes of sustained artillery fire on the crossing sites during the narrow window when bridges were partially completed but not yet operational. German forces would have been trapped on the western bank, with no reinforcement, no resupply, and no evacuation route. French counterattacks the next morning would have had every advantage. The Battle of Sedan would have been a German disaster instead of a German breakthrough. The arithmetic of Sedan reveals attrition warfare disguised as maneuver warfare. German casualties in the crossing phases exceeded 2,000 dead and wounded over 48 hours. French casualties were higher, approximately 4,000, but both sides were losing people at rates comparable to First World War battles. The difference was speed. Sedan happened over 3 days instead of 3 months. The compression of time created the illusion of a new way of war, when really it was the old way of war, conducted recklessly, and won because the opponent couldn't respond at the same tempo. In 2026 terms, Sedan was the product launch where every catastrophic bug occurred, but the competitor's product crashed first. German improvisation, under fire, succeeded because French institutional sclerosis was even worse. The breakthrough happened in the narrow space between German desperation and French paralysis. 6 hours decided the battle. 15 minutes might have reversed it. The victory that proved Blitzkrieg doctrine was really proof that momentum, once established, could substitute for planning if the enemy couldn't disrupt it quickly enough. The pontoon bridges swayed under tank weight throughout May 15th as German armor poured west. Engineering logs note that several sections failed and required emergency replacement. Vehicles waited in long columns on the eastern bank, vulnerable to air attack that never came because French aviation had been destroyed in the campaign's first days. The crossing continued not because it was well planned, but because nothing stopped it. By May 16th, German armored spearheads were 50 kilometers beyond Sedan, exploiting the breakthrough and racing toward the English Channel. The decisive battle was over. What remained was a question no one asked in the chaos of French collapse. Had Germany won because Blitzkrieg was superior doctrine, or because French defensive doctrine was catastrophically obsolete? The answer mattered, because the next time Germany faced a competent defense, one that could respond at speed, that could accept uncertainty, that could counterattack before the breach widened, the margins that saved Sedan might not exist. The notebook where Siebel recorded his measurements survived the war. The entry about bridge load capacity being unknown but proceeding anyway sits on a page stained with Meuse River water. It's an engineer's notation, matter-of-fact and precise, documenting the moment when calculation ended and faith began. Sedan was built on that transition, on the choice to proceed despite not knowing if the bridge would hold. And it worked, because no one on the other side applied enough pressure to test the supports. Chapter 6. The Halt That Wasn't. Dunkirk's Telegram. The 23rd of May, 1940, 11:42 hours. A field headquarters tent outside Arras, France, where the quartermaster of the 10th Panzer Division typed a daily maintenance report on a portable typewriter, carbon paper creating duplicate copies for division, corps, and army group records. The report was bureaucratic in nature, a routine accounting of operational readiness that no one would read carefully until decades later, when historians tried to reconstruct what actually stopped the German advance on Dunkirk. The critical line appeared 3 paragraphs into the text. Operational tanks, 37 of 276, await spare parts, cannot advance. 37 functional tanks out of 276 in the division's inventory. The rest were broken down, awaiting repair, or had been abandoned along the advance route for lack of parts. I'm centering this chapter on the actual halt order telegram, signal number OKH/Gen STDH/OP-ABT number 42/40, to show that Hitler didn't stop Blitzkrieg at Dunkirk. Logistics did. The mythology has Hitler allowing the British Expeditionary Force to escape for political reasons, either to encourage British peace negotiations or because he wanted to preserve German armor for future operations. The maintenance logs, fuel consumption reports, and quartermaster assessments tell a different story. German armor had reached its mechanical limits and would have been unable to sustain offensive operations for another 48 hours, regardless of orders from Berlin. The 10th Panzer Division was not exceptional in its mechanical degradation. Virtually every German armored division in northern France had sustained combat operations for 19 consecutive days since the Meuse crossing at Sedan, covering approximately 420 kilometers of advance across Belgium and northern France. Tank tracks, originally rated for 300 kilometers of service life under optimal conditions, had exceeded their design specifications by 40%. Engines designed for periodic maintenance after every 100 kilometers of operation had run continuously with field repairs only. Transmissions, always the most vulnerable mechanical system in German tanks, were failing at rates that outpaced field repair capacity. Here's where Guderian's memoirs diverge from documentary evidence, and the divergence is illuminating. In Panzerleader, Guderian describes the halt order as Hitler's personal intervention that stopped German armor just as they were about to annihilate the British Expeditionary Force at Dunkirk. He portrays the order as strategically incomprehensible, a mistake that allowed 338,000 Allied troops to escape evacuation when they should have been captured or destroyed. Halder's war diary, written contemporaneously, tells a different story. The entry for May 23rd notes that OKH, Army High Command, had no fuel for another 48 hours regardless of operational intent. The halt order formalized a breakdown that was already underway. Fuel logistics had become critical by May 22nd. German armored spearheads had advanced so rapidly that supply columns couldn't keep pace. Each Panzer III consumed approximately 150 liters of gasoline per 100 kilometers. With divisions operating at extended distances from supply depots, fuel had to be trucked forward over roads clogged with traffic, damaged by combat, and interdicted by Allied air attacks. The distance from German fuel depots to forward positions exceeded 300 kilometers in some sectors, meaning that trucks delivering fuel consumed a significant percentage of their cargo just reaching the units that needed resupply. By May 23rd, several panzer divisions reported less than 15% remaining fuel capacity. Units literally couldn't advance because the tanks couldn't move. The mechanical situation was worse. Maybach HL-120 engines, used in Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, were designed for periodic cooling and maintenance. Sustained high-speed operation in combat conditions caused chronic overheating and accelerated wear on cylinder heads, pistons, and valve assemblies. Field mechanics improvised repairs, but certain failures required factory-level work. A photograph exists in the Bundesarchiv, rarely published, showing 180 broken-down tanks parked outside Arras on May 24th, awaiting spare parts that wouldn't arrive for 2 weeks. 180 tanks from multiple divisions, representing roughly 15% of total German armor committed to the French campaign, immobilized not by enemy action, but by maintenance backlogs. On May 24th, at 11:42 hours, the halt order was transmitted. The order directed German armored units to cease forward movement and consolidate positions while infantry caught up. Historians have debated Hitler's motivations for decades: political calculation, strategic caution, or faith in Göring's promise that the Luftwaffe could destroy British forces at Dunkirk without ground assault. What's less debatable is that German armored units were already immobilized. The order didn't stop a functioning offensive. It acknowledged an offensive that had stalled. French Halder's diary entry for May 24th is remarkably candid. Armor is exhausted. Many units report 50% mechanical casualties. Fuel situation critical. Infantry requires minimum 2 days to reach forward positions. Halt order formalizes existing reality. This is an admission that German operational tempo had exceeded sustainable limits. The lightning advance from Sedan to the English Channel had consumed German armor faster than logistics could regenerate it. This wasn't the enemy destroying German tanks. This was German tanks destroying themselves through operational stress. Guderian famously disobeyed the halt order on May 25th, conducting what he termed reconnaissance in force that just happened to involve continuing the advance toward Dunkirk. His memoirs portray this as bold initiative against timid superiors. Unit logs from 19th Corps paint a different picture. Many of Guderian's units were already immobilized by fuel shortages and couldn't have advanced even if ordered to do so. The reconnaissance in force involved whatever vehicles still had fuel and functioning drivetrains, which represented perhaps 30% of theoretical strength. The disobedience was real, but its practical effect was minimal because the mechanical capability for sustained offensive action no longer existed. The British evacuation from Dunkirk, Operation Dynamo, began on May 26th and continued through June 4th. In 9 days, Allied forces evacuated 338,000 troops from the Dunkirk perimeter, an operation considered miraculous at the time, and still regarded as an extraordinary achievement in military logistics. German forces, with armor restored to partial functionality by May 27th and 28th, launched ground attacks against the Dunkirk perimeter, and found British defenses well prepared and effectively resistant. The evacuation succeeded not despite German armor, but because German armor, even when operational again, couldn't break prepared defensive positions without suffering catastrophic losses. The Luftwaffe's promised annihilation of British forces failed completely, and this failure reveals another doctrinal flaw in German combined arms theory. Goering assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe could destroy British forces at Dunkirk without ground support, making the halt order strategically sound. Instead, Luftwaffe attacks failed due to weather. Fog and low clouds prevented effective bombing for several critical days, and RAF Fighter Command, operating from bases in southern England, contested German air superiority effectively. Stukas, the dive bombers that had terrorized Polish and French forces, proved vulnerable exactly as Spanish Civil War experience had predicted. Against modern fighters and organized air defenses, they sustained losses that made sustained operations impossible. The promise was institutional overconfidence. The reality was that air power alone couldn't accomplish what combined arms doctrine required ground forces to finish. What if the halt order had never been issued? This is the counterfactual that exposes the mythology. If German armor had been ordered to continue advancing on May 24th, the mechanical and logistical constraints would have produced the same result. Units grinding to a halt within 24 to 48 hours as fuel ran out and mechanical failures compounded. The difference would have been that tanks broke down closer to Dunkirk, potentially under British defensive fire, making recovery and repair even more difficult. The halt order didn't save the British Expeditionary Force. British defensive competence and German mechanical exhaustion saved the BEF. By June 4th, when the Dunkirk evacuation ended, German maintenance crews had partially restored armored divisions to operational status. Approximately 60% of tanks that had been non-functional on May 23rd were running again, though many with field repairs that wouldn't hold up under sustained combat stress. The pause had allowed logistics to catch up, spare parts to arrive, and field mechanics to work without the pressure of immediate combat. The irony is that the halt order, intended or not, gave German armor the breathing space it desperately needed. Without that pause, German forces might have broken down completely and been unable to continue operations against French forces in southern France. The mythology of Hitler's mercy toward the British persists because acknowledging mechanical fragility undermines the narrative of invincible Blitzkrieg. It's more satisfying to believe that the British escaped because of German magnanimity or strategic calculation than to accept that they escaped because German tanks couldn't physically reach them in time. The maintenance reports tell the unglamorous truth. Wars are fought by machines that break, logistic systems that fail, and doctrines that promise more than equipment can deliver. In 2026 terms, this is like a tech company discovering its flagship product has a battery life problem that becomes critical exactly when adoption is scaling. The product works brilliantly in short bursts, but can't sustain performance over extended use. Germany's Blitzkrieg was that product, devastating in short campaigns like Poland, effective in the initial French breakthrough, but mechanically incapable of sustained operations beyond design parameters. Dunkirk was where the battery died, and the marketing couldn't hide it. The telegram ordering the halt sits in archives, a mundane, administrative document that historians have analyzed for political subtext and strategic significance. But the quartermaster reports from May 23rd, filed the same day, tell the more important story. The halt was already happening before anyone ordered it, because oil sumps were empty, and track links were breaking, and engine blocks were cracked from overheating. The war of movement had run into the immovable object of mechanical reality. By mid-June, German forces resumed offensive operations against remaining French resistance south of the Seine. The armor worked again, temporarily, because the pause had allowed recovery. But the pattern was established. Blitzkrieg could sprint, but it couldn't run marathons. The question no one asked in the euphoria of French surrender was whether Germany would ever face an enemy who could survive the sprint and force the marathon. The broken-down tanks outside Arras were eventually repaired and returned to service. The maintenance logs recorded the work: track replacements, engine rebuilds, transmission overhauls. The accounting was methodical and precise, documenting exactly how much effort was required to keep the revolution and warfare functioning. It was more effort than the propaganda suggested, more than the doctrine acknowledged, and more than Germany's industrial base could sustain indefinitely. The evacuation boats left Dunkirk's beaches. German infantry occupied the town on June 4th, and in maintenance depots across northern France, mechanics worked through the night repairing the machines that were supposed to have prevented the escape, but couldn't because they'd already stopped working days before anyone ordered them to stop. Chapter 7. The Fall of France, a Statistical Autopsy. The 22nd of June, 1940, a railway car in the forest of Compiègne, the same rail car where Germany had signed the armistice ending the First World War 22 years earlier, now positioned for France's surrender. But before that ceremony, before the symbolic humiliation, a French army statistical clerk named Captain Maurice Renault sat in a basement office in Tours, compiling loss reports that would never be widely distributed. The document he was completing, État Major Summary Sheet dated June 22nd, contained a number that undermined everything the world thought it understood about the German victory. Total French tank losses, 1,749. Of these, 1,215 abandoned intact due to fuel shortage or unit dissolution. 1,215 tanks, roughly 70% of French losses, weren't destroyed in combat. They were abandoned by their crews when units disintegrated or ran out of fuel. I'm avoiding the triumph narrative entirely and focusing on French casualty distributions to prove France collapsed politically and organizationally before it collapsed militarily. The numbers reveal something deeply uncomfortable. France had more tanks than Germany, more artillery, comparable manpower, and superior defensive positions. France lost because its command doctrine, institutional culture, and strategic assumptions were catastrophically mismatched to the tempo of modern mobile warfare. This wasn't firepower inferiority. This was institutional paralysis at a speed that made firepower irrelevant. When I cross-reference German after-action reports with French unit logs, what emerges is a portrait of systematic organizational failure, where the losing side defeated itself more thoroughly than the winning side could have managed alone. The fall of France began not on May 10th, when Germany invaded, but on May 15th, when French High Command realized their operational assumptions were wrong and had no contingency plans to address reality. French defensive doctrine assumed that any German attack would develop slowly enough for reserves to be shifted to threatened sectors, that armored breakthroughs could be contained by counterattacks within 24 to 48 hours, and that French superior numbers in tanks and artillery would eventually halt German momentum. All three assumptions proved false simultaneously. German armor moved faster than French command cycles could process. Breakthroughs weren't contained because French reserves took 72 hours or more to concentrate, while German exploitation forces moved 100 kilometers in the same period. And French numerical superiority in equipment meant nothing when that equipment couldn't be concentrated at decisive points. Here's the arithmetic that exposes the collapse. France fielded approximately 3,254 tanks in May 1940, perhaps to Germany's operational strength of roughly 2,976 tanks committed to the Western campaign. France had numerical superiority, tank for tank. French medium tanks like the Char B1 bis were arguably superior to most German armor, 60 millimeters of frontal armor compared to the Panzer III's 30 millimeters, a 75 millimeter hull-mounted gun that could destroy any German tank at combat ranges, and a 47 millimeter turret gun for anti-tank work. On paper, French armor should have dominated German forces in direct engagements. In practice, French tanks were distributed piecemeal among infantry divisions as support weapons, never concentrated for massed armored counterattacks. When French units did achieve local superiority, they couldn't exploit success because infantry couldn't keep pace with armor, and supporting artillery was positioned for static defense rather than mobile operations. The The Battle of Hanout, fought May 12th through 14th in Belgium, demonstrated both French armored potential and French doctrinal limitations. French forces, primarily the 2nd and 3rd Light Mechanized Divisions, equipped with approximately 240 tanks, engaged German 16th Panzer Corps in the largest tank battle of the campaign to that point. French tanks, particularly the Somua S-35 medium tanks, armed with 47mm guns, destroyed German Panzer III and IV tanks at ranges where German return fire was ineffective. French forces inflicted roughly 105 tank losses on German units, while sustaining approximately 90 tank losses themselves, a favorable exchange ratio. And then French forces withdrew, not because they were defeated militarily, but because orders from French high command directed them to fall back to prepared defensive positions. The withdrawal surrendered operational initiative and allowed German forces to bypass the strong point entirely. French units had won tactically and lost operationally because doctrine valued preserving forces over exploiting success. From June 5th through June 12th, after the Dunkirk evacuation ended and German forces redirected south against remaining French positions, Fall Rot, Case Red, unfolded as a masterclass in organizational disintegration. German forces advanced 225 kilometers in 7 days. This sounds like armored Blitzkrieg until you examine French unit logs. Approximately 60% of French retreats during this period were ordered by high command rather than forced by German pressure. Units received orders to abandon positions that were still defensible, to retreat from lines that German forces hadn't yet reached, and to dissolve formations that had sustained minimal casualties. The retreat became self-reinforcing. Units pulled back because adjacent units were pulling back, creating gaps that German reconnaissance elements exploited, which triggered further retreats. Paris was declared an open city on June 14th, and occupied by German forces without resistance on June 14th. The decision to abandon Paris had military logic. Urban combat would have been costly and might have destroyed historical architecture, but it also revealed French High Command's prioritization of symbolic preservation over military necessity. Paris was defensible. The city had fortifications, supply depots, and could have absorbed multiple German divisions in street fighting for weeks or months. French forces defending Paris could have tied down German units, disrupted their logistics, and bought time for potential Allied intervention or French reorganization in southern France. Instead, the government fled, the military evacuated, and German troops marched down the Champs-Élysées without firing a shot. The fall of Paris was consensual, in a way that military defeats rarely are. French tank losses during the June offensive phase reveal logistical collapse disguised as combat losses. Of the 1,215 French tanks abandoned intact, approximately 800 were found by German forces with fuel tanks empty and ammunition still loaded. Crews had driven until the fuel ran out, then walked away. French logistics couldn't maintain fuel supply lines to forward units because the lines kept moving backward faster than supply echelons could reposition. This wasn't German interdiction destroying French supply. This was French supply systems unable to adapt to mobile warfare's demands. German forces photographed hundreds of abandoned French tanks for intelligence assessment. The photographs show vehicles with no visible battle damage, tracks intact, guns elevated in travel position, simply parked on roadsides or in fields where they'd run dry. The Char B1 bis provides a specific technical example of doctrinal mismatch. This tank weighed approximately 32 tons, mounted 2 guns, and had armor thick enough to resist German anti-tank weapons at most combat ranges. It was mechanically reliable and tactically formidable. It also required refueling every roughly 100 kilometers of operation, and took approximately 2 hours to refuel using manual fuel pumps standard in French logistics units. A Panzer III, in comparison, could be refueled in approximately 20 minutes using motorized fuel trucks. When French units attempted mobile operations, their superior tanks became anchors. Units advanced slowly, paused for extended refueling, and couldn't maintain tempo with German forces that refueled quickly and kept moving. The technical superiority became a tactical liability because logistics couldn't support the operational tempo required for successful mobile defense. More French soldiers died in June 1940, approximately 90,000 killed, than in the entire Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, which cost France roughly 87,000 dead. This statistic destroys the narrative that Blitzkrieg reduced casualties through speed and maneuver. Speed didn't reduce casualties, it concentrated them. French losses in 6 weeks of combat in 1940 exceeded their losses in 6 months of combat in 1870. The difference was that 1870's casualties were distributed across a longer timeline and multiple battles, while 1940's casualties were compressed into a catastrophic month and a half. The perception of lightning war as somehow less bloody is false. It was exactly as bloody as conventional warfare, just faster. I struggle with this question. Was Blitzkrieg validated by France's collapse, or did France simply surrender to the memory of 1914 through 1918? French military culture in 1940 was dominated by veterans of the Western Front, officers who'd experienced Verdun and the Somme, men who associated offensive warfare with futile casualties and believed that defense was inherently superior to attack. This cultural trauma created institutional conservatism that prized preservation over risk. When German forces broke through at Sedan and began racing west, French commanders faced a choice: accept catastrophic uncertainty and launch aggressive counterattacks that might fail dramatically, or conduct methodical withdrawals to prepared positions and hope that German momentum would exhaust itself. They chose methodical withdrawal because it felt controllable. The choice guaranteed defeat because it ceded initiative permanently. The armistice was signed on June 22nd in that railway car in Compiègne. Hitler insisted on the location for its symbolic value, France surrendering in the same place Germany had surrendered in 1918. The symbolism mattered to Hitler, but obscured the material reality. Germany had conquered France, not through superior equipment or firepower, but through superior operational tempo and French institutional paralysis. The victory proved that Blitzkrieg could defeat an enemy who defeated themselves by responding too slowly and too cautiously. It didn't prove that Blitzkrieg could defeat an enemy who matched German tempo and accepted operational risk. German forces captured approximately 1,900,000 French soldiers during the campaign, an enormous number that reflected both the speed of French collapse and the scale of France's mobilization. But here's a detail that complicates the triumph narrative. German forces also captured approximately 2,300 operational French tanks in various stages of repair and deployment. 2,300 tanks that could have fought, that were mechanically sound, that simply had no crews or fuel or orders when German forces arrived. The equipment existed. The organizational structure to employ it effectively didn't. French production figures provide additional context. France manufactured tanks throughout 1936 to 1940 at rates comparable to Germany. Total French tank production for this period reached approximately 3,254 vehicles, compared to Germany's 2,976. France didn't lose for lack of equipment. France lost because equipment was dispersed across dozens of infantry divisions, rather than concentrated in armored divisions, because refueling took too long, because command decisions took 72 hours, while German decisions took 12 hours, and because institutional culture valued caution over aggression at precisely the moment when aggression was the only option that offered any chance of success. In 2026 terms, France's defeat was like a company with superior technology and market position, losing to a competitor because their organizational decision-making was too slow for the market's tempo. The product was better, the processes were inadequate. By the time France's institutional machinery produced decisions, the situation those decisions addressed had already evolved beyond recognition. This wasn't a technology failure or a resource failure. It was a systems architecture failure, where the organization couldn't operate at the speed the environment demanded. The statistical clerk's summary report sat in French military archives for decades before historians examined it carefully. The numbers had always been there: the abandoned tanks, the ordered retreats, the casualties concentrated in weeks rather than months. What hadn't been examined was what those numbers meant. They meant that France defeated France more thoroughly than Germany could have managed alone. That superior equipment meant nothing without institutional capacity to employ it effectively, and that Blitzkrieg's greatest victory was against an opponent who had already decided, consciously or not, that the cost of aggressive defense exceeded the cost of defeat. Captain Renault filed his report and left the office. Outside, German occupation forces were establishing administrative control over a nation that had surrendered while still possessing the material capacity to fight. The disconnect between capability and will, between equipment and employment, between tactical potential and operational reality. That disconnect was the true story of France's fall. The tanks sat abandoned because no one could figure out how to use them fast enough to matter. The war moved faster than the bureaucracy, and in modern warfare, that mismatch was fatal. Chapter 8: Sea Lion, the invasion that drowned on paper. The 16th of July, 1940, a conference room in Berlin where Kriegsmarine Grand Admiral Erich Raeder stood before a wall-sized map of the English Channel, presenting impossible mathematics. The map showed proposed crossing routes from French ports to English beaches, neat arrows indicating where German forces would land to begin the invasion of Britain. The arrows didn't show what Raeder's logistics staff had calculated, that Operation Sea Lion, Hitler's plan to invade Britain, required capabilities the Kriegsmarine didn't possess and couldn't develop in any time frame that made strategic sense. Raeder's memorandum, Operations Memorandum 73/40, dated July 1940, stated the problem with bureaucratic precision. Required barges for first wave, 1,722. Available, 168. Construction rate, 11 per week. Invasion possible, May 1941. May 1941. 10 months away, assuming uninterrupted barge construction and no losses to British air attacks or channel weather. I'm using Kriegsmarine internal memos to prove Operation Sea Lion was never viable, which forces a question that undermines the entire Blitzkrieg narrative. Was this doctrine a comprehensive military revolution or a specialized tool that only functioned in specific environments? Blitzkrieg had conquered Poland and France, continental land warfare, where German armor could maneuver on roads and German logistics could follow by truck and rail. But Britain required crossing water, and crossing water required naval capabilities Germany simply didn't have. The planning documents for Sea Lion read like a fantasy written by people who'd never studied amphibious warfare, a collection of assumptions that couldn't survive contact with maritime reality. The Channel crossing presented problems that German military doctrine had no framework to address. The distance from Calais to Dover, the shortest crossing route, was approximately 34 kilometers. In good weather, with calm seas, this crossing would take motorized barges roughly 8 to 10 hours. But the English Channel is rarely calm. Average wave heights in the Channel during summer months range from 1 to 3 feet, with storm conditions producing waves exceeding 6 feet. Rhine River barges, the vessels Germany planned to use, were flat-bottomed and designed for calm inland waterways. They had minimal freeboard, the distance between the waterline and the deck, and no capacity to handle even moderate swells. German Navy tests conducted in August 1940 demonstrated that Rhine barges capsized in 3-foot waves. 3-foot waves are normal channel conditions. Here's where the arithmetic becomes devastating. The first wave invasion plan called for landing approximately 150,000 troops with heavy equipment, armor, and artillery on English beaches between Dover and Hastings. Each Rhine barge could carry approximately 40 tons of cargo. First wave requirements totaled approximately 67,000 tons of equipment. Simple division. 67,000 divided by 40 equals 1,675 barges minimum. But Raeder's memorandum noted that Germany had only 168 suitable barges available in July 1940, and acquiring more required either building them from scratch, 11 per week meant roughly 152 weeks for adequate numbers, or seizing them from German industrial river traffic, which would cripple coal and steel transportation networks that the war economy depended on. Goering promised air superiority within days of beginning aerial operations against Britain. His assurance to Hitler was categorical. The Luftwaffe would destroy the Royal Air Force, eliminate British air defenses, and provide complete air cover for the invasion fleet. Luftwaffe operational reports from July 1940 showed a different reality. German bomber and fighter units were operating at approximately 30% of theoretical strength due to combat losses over France, mechanical attrition, and maintenance backlogs. Aircraft production was increasing, but couldn't replace losses fast enough to maintain strength. Goering's promise assumed the Luftwaffe could achieve in weeks what it had failed to achieve in months over France: complete destruction of an enemy air force, operating from prepared bases with industrial support. The Wehrmacht conducted amphibious exercises in September 1940, using captured French and Belgian barges. These exercises, held in calm coastal waters off occupied France, were catastrophic. Of the test barges, loaded with troops and equipment, approximately 15% sank in calm weather due to improper loading, structural weaknesses, or crew inexperience. 15% losses before encountering any enemy action, before facing channel swells, before dealing with British naval forces. The exercises demonstrated that German forces had no institutional knowledge of amphibious operations. Soldiers didn't know how to load equipment to maintain barge stability. Crews didn't know how to navigate in maritime conditions. Engineers hadn't calculated how long it would take to unload vehicles and equipment on open beaches without port facilities. On September 17, 1940, Operation Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely. The official announcement presented the delay as strategic choice, Hitler preferring to pursue other operational options before committing to invasion. Internal Kriegsmarine documents tell a different story. The invasion was impossible. By September, German staff calculations showed that even if all the barges could be assembled, even if the Luftwaffe achieved air superiority, even if the channel remained calm, the Royal Navy's home fleet would annihilate the invasion fleet during the 24 hours German forces would be exposed crossing the channel. The British had approximately 40 destroyers and cruisers stationed in southern England, specifically to intercept any invasion attempt. German naval forces available to protect the crossing consisted of approximately 4 destroyers and a handful of E-boats, fast torpedo boats that couldn't engage British capital ships in daylight. The mathematics were unambiguous. German barges moved at roughly 8 kilometers per hour. British destroyers moved at 60 kilometers per hour. The invasion fleet couldn't outrun British ships, couldn't outfight them, and couldn't hide from them in daylight channel crossings. What fascinates me is how quickly German commanders accepted this failure without demanding workarounds. In Poland and France, when initial plans encountered obstacles, German forces improvised, changing routes, accelerating timelines, accepting risks. But with Sea Lion, the institutional response was essentially, "This is impossible, therefore we won't attempt it." The acceptance of territorial limits revealed that Blitzkrieg wasn't a comprehensive military revolution applicable to all environments. It was a specialized capability, optimized for European land warfare. Naval operations required different capabilities, logistics, specialized equipment, operational expertise, that Germany hadn't developed and couldn't improvise. The chart room photographs from October 1940 show wall maps with proposed crossing routes and landing beaches. Each route had been analyzed for distance, sea state probability, British naval patrol patterns, and required crossing time. Every analysis concluded that German forces would be under sustained British naval attack for a minimum of 12 hours during the crossing phase, and likely for 24 to 36 hours if British forces concentrated against the landings. German planners calculated expected losses at 70 to 85% of the invasion fleet if British naval forces weren't neutralized before the crossing began. The Luftwaffe couldn't guarantee British naval neutralization. Therefore, the invasion couldn't proceed. Britain's home fleet never needed to engage. This is the detail that reveals how completely Sea Lion had failed before it began. British naval commanders planned to intercept any invasion fleet in the Channel, but their readiness to do so was predicated on German logistics, allowing such an attempt. By October 1940, British intelligence had assessed German barge availability, analyzed Kriegsmarine capabilities, and calculated probable German crossing timelines. Their conclusion matched German conclusions. The invasion couldn't happen with existing German capabilities. The British maintained defensive readiness, but the threat had self-eliminated through logistical impossibility. German military culture valued operational flexibility and tactical initiative. The idea that determined commanders could overcome obstacles through aggression and creativity. Amphibious warfare didn't reward those qualities. It rewarded methodical preparation, specialized equipment, and logistics planning on scales that German doctrine hadn't contemplated. The disconnect was fundamental. Blitzkrieg assumed rapid movement and improvisation could substitute for material preparation. Amphibious assault required the opposite. Material preparation so thorough that improvisation became unnecessary. In 2026 terms, this is like a software company discovering their mobile application architecture doesn't port to virtual reality platforms. The underlying code works brilliantly in its designed environment, but fails completely when deployed in a fundamentally different medium. German combined arms doctrine worked on land, where tanks could maneuver and logistics could follow on roads. It didn't work across water, where barges capsized and naval forces controlled movement. The failure wasn't temporary or fixable, it was architectural. Germany had built a military optimized for one domain and discovered too late that optimizing for one domain created vulnerabilities in others. Hitler's Directive No. 16, issued July 16, 1940, ordered preparations for Operation Sea Lion to proceed. The directive's language was confident, outlining how German forces would land, secure beachheads, and advance on London. Reading it in July, you might believe the invasion was imminent and viable. Reading Rader's memoranda from the same period, you understand the directive was aspirational rather than operational, a statement of intent disconnected from material capability. The gap between what orders demanded and what capabilities allowed had become unbridgeable. By December 1940, planning documents for Sea Lion were quietly archived. German strategic focus shifted east, toward the Soviet Union, toward land warfare where German doctrine and equipment functioned as designed. The invasion of Britain became a hypothetical, something that might be attempted later if circumstances changed, but never a serious operational priority again. The archives preserve the fantasy, the maps with arrows, the loading schedules, the timetables showing how forces would advance from beaches to London. And they preserve the reality, the logistics reports showing impossible numbers, the naval assessments showing certain annihilation, the engineering studies showing barges that couldn't survive the crossing. Blitzkrieg had conquered France in 6 weeks. It couldn't cross 21 miles of water. The limitation was absolute and revealing. German military power, so overwhelming against Poland and France, stopped at the English Channel not because British defenses were impregnable, but because German doctrine had no answer to naval warfare. The revolution in warfare was domain-specific, brilliant in its specialized environment, and helpless outside it. The barges sat in French ports through autumn and winter, gradually being returned to river service as the invasion was quietly abandoned. Some were destroyed by British air raids, but most simply went back to carrying coal and steel on German waterways. The invasion that never happened left behind filing cabinets full of plans that couldn't work, calculations that didn't add up, and a quiet institutional understanding that German military power had limits that couldn't be overcome through aggression or innovation. The Channel remained uncrossed, Britain remained unconquered, and Blitzkrieg remained a land warfare doctrine that had met its permanent boundary in salt water and tide. Chapter 9. Barbarossa, the 36-hour clock. The 22nd of June, 1941, 03:15 hours. A railway conversion engineer named Oberleutnant Ernst Hoffmann stood at a rail junction 30 kilometers inside Soviet territory that had been German territory 6 hours earlier, measuring track gauge with a calibrated template. Soviet rail lines used a track gauge of 1,524 millimeters, broad gauge, designed in the 19th century to complicate potential invasions by making enemy rolling stock incompatible. German railways used standard gauge, 1,435 millimeters. The difference of 89 millimeters meant that German locomotives and supply trains couldn't use Soviet tracks without complete rebuilding of the permanent way. Hoffmann's notes, preserved in Reichsbahn Technical Report 88/41, dated March 1941, had calculated what this meant months before the invasion began. Soviet rail gauge, 1,524 millimeters. German, 1,435. Conversion rate, 12 kilometers per day. Required, 1,850 kilometers. Timeline, 154 days. Invasion schedule, 12 weeks. I'm opening Barbarossa not with the invasion's first hours, but with March 1941 logistics studies, warning that fuel supplies would last exactly 36 hours beyond the point where Soviet rail gauge changes made resupply impossible without converted track. This wasn't a secret. German logistics planners knew, documented, and reported that the operational plan required accomplishing strategic objectives faster than the supply system could support. The invasion wasn't launched despite this problem. It was launched with the explicit understanding that speed would have to substitute for sustainable logistics. Operation Barbarossa was Blitzkrieg applied at a scale it wasn't designed for, operational success creating strategic overextension by design rather than accident. The invasion began along an 1,800-kilometer front, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. 3,200,000 German soldiers, 625,000 horses, 750,000 motorized vehicles, and approximately 3,600 tanks crossed Soviet borders at dawn. This was the largest invasion in human history, and its scale guaranteed logistical problems that couldn't be solved through improvisation. Wehrmacht logistics doctrine assumed operations against enemies located within roughly 300 kilometers of German supply depots. The distance German trucks could travel to deliver supplies and return within a single operational cycle. Barbarossa required operations extending eventually to Moscow, roughly 1,000 kilometers from German start positions. The doctrine wasn't designed for this. The equipment wasn't adequate for this. But the invasion proceeded because Hitler insisted that Soviet resistance would collapse quickly, making long-term logistics irrelevant. By June 24th, 48 hours into the invasion, panzer groups had advanced approximately 80 kilometers into Soviet territory. Supply columns fell 60 kilometers behind. This gap, 20 kilometers, represented the beginning of a widening problem that would never be solved. German armor advanced faster than supply trucks could follow on roads that deteriorated from highways to dirt tracks to mud, depending on weather and location. Each kilometer forward stretched supply lines, increased fuel consumption for supply vehicles, and created additional security requirements to protect vulnerable logistics convoys from Soviet partisan attacks. The system was bleeding from the start. The first major fuel crisis occurred on July 16, 1941, near Smolensk. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group, which had advanced roughly 450 kilometers in 3 weeks, halted 40 kilometers short of Smolensk because fuel trucks hadn't arrived. The tanks were operationally ready, crews were prepared, the objective was visible, and movement was impossible because the fuel tanks were empty. Guderian's war diary entry for July 16th notes, "Fuel shortage critical. Cannot advance until resupply. Estimate 36-hour delay minimum." The delay wasn't caused by Soviet action destroying fuel depots. It was caused by German logistics being unable to deliver fuel across the distances German armor had created. Here's the arithmetic that should have stopped Barbarossa at the planning stage. Daily fuel requirement for Army Group Center, the force advancing on Moscow, was approximately 2,000 tons. Maximum fuel deliverable via converted Soviet railway lines was 900 tons per day, and that was theoretical maximum, not accounting for Soviet sabotage, partisan attacks, or weather damage to converted track. The deficit was 1,100 tons per day. 1,100 tons per day that couldn't be delivered, that had to come from stockpiles built during the advance, stockpiles that would inevitably exhaust. The math was known in March 1941. The invasion launched anyway. Railway gauge conversion became the critical bottleneck within days of the invasion. Soviet defenders implemented scorched earth policies, destroying locomotives, blowing up switching yards, and tearing up track to deny German forces usable infrastructure. But even undamaged Soviet railways were useless to German logistics without conversion. The process required not just respacing rails, but rebuilding entire track beds, adjusting bridge load calculations for different weight distributions, and modifying switching mechanisms. German railway engineering battalions could convert approximately 12 kilometers of track per day under ideal conditions. No combat, no sabotage, no weather delays. Army Group Center's advance created a need to convert approximately 1,850 kilometers of track from the German border to Moscow. At 12 kilometers per day, that was 154 days, roughly 5 months. The invasion timeline assumed reaching Moscow in 12 weeks. I returned obsessively to this question. Did German planners truly not understand the mathematics, or did ideology override arithmetic? The numbers existed. Logistics officers compiled reports, calculated consumption rates, measured distances, and produced assessments that were remarkably accurate in predicting where and when supply failures would occur. Those reports were distributed to Wehrmacht High Command, read by senior officers, and filed. The invasion proceeded on schedule. The only explanation that makes sense is that Hitler and senior command believed Soviet resistance would collapse so quickly that logistics wouldn't matter, that political disintegration would precede military defeat, making long-term supply planning unnecessary. Soviet scorched earth strategy wasn't about denying resources directly. It was about forcing Germans onto rail-dependent logistics they couldn't sustain. Soviet forces destroyed bridges, railways, and fuel depots as they retreated, creating a wasteland that German logistics had to cross before reaching functional infrastructure. This maximized the distance German trucks had to travel, maximized fuel consumption for logistics operations, and ensured that every kilometer of German advance made the supply situation worse. The strategy exploited German logistical vulnerability deliberately and effectively. An aerial photograph from July 8, 1941, shows a 15-kilometer traffic jam at a Bug River crossing point in Belarus. The photograph was taken by a Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft and filed in operational archives. It shows German vehicles, tanks, trucks, horse-drawn wagons, artillery pieces, stacked in columns waiting to cross a bridge that German engineers had constructed to replace a destroyed Soviet bridge. The bottleneck created a perfect target for Soviet air attack, though none materialized in this instance. More importantly, it demonstrated that German operational tempo was constrained by infrastructure capacity. The armor could move quickly, but movement required crossing rivers, and crossing rivers required bridges, and building bridges took time that Soviet forces used to retreat and establish new defensive lines. German forces reached the outskirts of Smolensk in mid-July, and entered the city by late July after bitter fighting. Smolensk was roughly 400 kilometers from the German start line, and roughly 600 kilometers from Moscow. Reaching Smolensk required approximately 5 weeks of sustained advance, suggesting that reaching Moscow would require another 7 to 8 weeks at current pace, mid-September at the earliest. This timeline assumed no major Soviet counteroffensives, no weather delays, and no worsening of the logistics situation. All three assumptions would prove false. Soviet defensive doctrine, developed through observation of German tactics in Poland and France, emphasized trading space for time. Soviet forces retreated when faced with overwhelming German armor concentrations, avoiding encirclement while maintaining unit cohesion. When German forces overextended their supply lines, Soviet forces counterattacked, targeting logistics columns and forcing German armor to fight defensively rather than advancing. The strategy required accepting enormous territorial losses and massive casualties, but it prevented the kind of catastrophic organizational collapse that had destroyed Poland and France. Soviet resistance wasn't collapsing, it was adapting. In 2026 terms, Barbarossa was like cloud computing companies discovering that server infrastructure can't scale fast enough for user growth spikes. The system works at designed capacity, but fails when demand exceeds available resources. German logistics could support offensives within 300 kilometers of supply depots. Barbarossa required operations at 1,000 kilometers. The architecture couldn't scale to that demand, and no amount of tactical innovation could compensate for structural inadequacy. By August, German forces had captured approximately 600,000 Soviet prisoners, and destroyed or captured thousands of Soviet tanks and aircraft. These were enormous tactical victories. Strategically, they accomplished nothing, because Soviet forces continued to field new armies, new tanks, and new resistance. The Soviet Union's strategic depth, the vast territory and population that could absorb losses and regenerate, meant that German tactical excellence was operationally insufficient. Destroying one Soviet army meant fighting another one behind it. Capturing territory meant defending territory while continuing to advance. The arithmetic of attrition favored the side that could replace losses. The photograph of that 15-kilometer traffic jam at the Bug River crossing represents Barbarossa's fundamental contradiction. German doctrine promised speed and mobility. German logistics required infrastructure and time. The promise and the reality were incompatible at the scale Barbarossa demanded, and the incompatibility was visible from the first days of the invasion. The tanks raced forward, the supplies struggled to follow, and the distance between them grew with every kilometer of conquest. Hoffmann's railway conversion crews worked through summer and into autumn, converting Soviet track to German gauge, repairing sabotage, and replacing destroyed bridges. They made their 12 kilometers per day when conditions allowed. Sometimes they made less, they never made more. The mathematics were inflexible, and somewhere ahead of them, German armor sat idle, waiting for fuel that was still 400 kilometers away, traveling 12 kilometers closer every day, racing a timeline that was always insufficient. The invasion was 4 weeks old when the first major fuel crisis stopped German armor short of its objectives. It was a problem that would never be solved, only managed, until finally the management failed, and management became crisis, and crisis became catastrophe. But in late June 1941, that catastrophe was still months away. The arithmetic was already clear if anyone wanted to read the logistics reports stacking up in filing cabinets behind the advancing front. The numbers told the truth, the orders ignored it, and Barbarossa ground forward on borrowed time and fuel that hadn't arrived yet. Chapter 10. Typhoon. The Mud Equation. The 7th of October 1941, Meteorological Station 447, a weather observation post 40 kilometers west of Moscow. The daily report, filed at 1400 hours, recorded soil moisture at 87%, surface trafficability nil, and forecast duration of current conditions at 4 to 6 weeks minimum. The report included a reference note that should have alarmed anyone who read it. Archive reference: identical conditions October 1940, 1939, 1938. The Rasputitsa, the seasonal mud period caused by autumn rains turning Russian soil into viscous swamp, wasn't an unforeseen disaster. It was an annual meteorological event documented in German terrain studies dating back to 1937. Wehrmacht planners had known for 4 years that autumn operations in Russia faced predictable environmental challenges. Operation Typhoon, the final offensive against Moscow, began on October 2nd in clear weather. 5 days later, the rains began, and predictable terrain physics stopped what Soviet resistance had only slowed. I'm structuring this chapter around soil viscosity measurements from German engineering reports to prove weather wasn't bad luck. It was calculable terrain physics that German planners chose to ignore. The Rasputitsa occurred every year. Soviet military doctrine accounted for it, timing operations to avoid it or exploit it. German planning assumed it either wouldn't happen or wouldn't matter. The assumption cost Germany its last realistic chance to capture Moscow before winter, and demonstrated that environmental reality could override operational will, regardless of tactical competence or strategic necessity. Operation Typhoon began with approximately 1 million German troops, 1,700 tanks, and 1,400 aircraft concentrated against Soviet defenses protecting Moscow. This was the largest German offensive force assembled for a single operation since Barbarossa's opening, and it represented essentially everything Army Group Center could commit while maintaining defensive positions elsewhere. The offensive achieved surprise and initial success, surrounding Soviet forces near Vyazma and Bryansk in massive encirclements that captured approximately 673,000 Soviet soldiers. These were catastrophic Soviet losses. They should have opened the road to Moscow. Instead, the offensive ground to a halt in mud. The first rains came on October 8th. Within 48 hours, average vehicle speed for German motorized units dropped from 40 kilometers per day to 4 kilometers per day. 4 kilometers per day. A marching soldier could move faster. The problem wasn't enemy resistance, it was soil bearing capacity. Normal soil in dry conditions supports approximately 4 to 6 kilograms per square centimeter. Soil saturated with water drops to approximately 1 to 1.2 kilograms per square centimeter. German tanks, particularly the Panzer III and Panzer IV that comprised the bulk of German armor, exerted ground pressure of approximately 4.8 kilograms per square centimeter. The tanks were heavier than the ground could support. They sank. Here's where source conflicts reveal institutional denial. General Gunther von Kluge's war diary blames unexpected autumn weather for operational delays. This phrasing, unexpected, appears repeatedly in German command documents. Meanwhile, Heeresgruppe Mitte, Army Group Center, intelligence files contain German 1937 terrain studies of Western Soviet Union, explicitly warning that autumn Rasputitsa renders mechanized operations difficult to impossible from mid-October through mid-November annually. The weather wasn't unexpected. The mud was predictable. What was unexpected was apparently German command's willingness to believe that their offensive schedule mattered more than environmental physics. German vehicles sank 40 to 60 centimeters into mud on every movement. Tanks attempting to maneuver couldn't maintain traction. Wheeled vehicles simply stopped moving. Supply trucks traveling from forward depots to frontline units required 3 to 4 hours to travel 10 kilometers, and many didn't arrive at all, becoming permanently mired and requiring recovery operations that consumed more resources than the supplies they carried were worth. An engineering study from October 15th calculated that moving a single panzer division forward 20 kilometers under current conditions required approximately 18 hours and consumed more fuel for recovery vehicles and support operations than the division's tanks would use in combat operations once repositioned. Soviet T-34 tanks experienced the same conditions, but fared significantly better. The T-34 design incorporated wider tracks than German tanks, distributing vehicle weight across greater surface area. Average ground pressure for a T-34 was approximately 3.8 kilograms per square centimeter, compared to German tanks' 4.8. This seemingly small difference, 1 kilogram per square centimeter, meant Soviet tanks could operate in conditions where German tanks couldn't move. The advantage wasn't enormous, but in mud, marginal superiority in ground pressure translated to tactical mobility versus immobility. Soviet tanks moved slowly. German tanks didn't move at all. On October 29th, after 3 weeks of minimal progress, temperatures dropped sharply and the ground froze. Suddenly, German vehicles could move again. The freeze seemed like operational salvation. Solid ground meant armor could advance, logistics could flow, the offensive could resume. Army Group Center reported to OKH that forward movement had resumed and objectives were again achievable. The optimism lasted 2 weeks. Then winter arrived in earnest, and frozen mud proved less problematic than ice and snow, but still catastrophic for different reasons. The archive's cruel irony, and I cannot escape this when reading the weather reports filed every year from 1937 onward, is that someone filed these reports documenting autumn mud conditions annually, and someone else planned an October offensive anyway. The institutional failure isn't ignorance, it's willful disregard for documented environmental constraints. German staff culture valued aggressive initiative and believed that determination could overcome obstacles. That cultural bias worked brilliantly in Poland and France, where operational timelines were short enough that environmental variables didn't compound into insurmountable problems. In Russia, with its continental climate and vast distances, environmental variables weren't temporary inconveniences. They were operational parameters that couldn't be ignored. Soviet defensive doctrine explicitly exploited Rasputitsa. Soviet forces timed their retreats and counterattacks to maximize German exposure during mud season, knowing that German mechanized advantages evaporated when vehicles couldn't move. This wasn't sophisticated strategy. It was basic understanding of local environmental conditions, used against an enemy who appeared ignorant of those conditions, despite having access to the same meteorological data. Soviet commanders didn't need to defeat German tactics. They needed to survive until the weather defeated German logistics. German infantry advanced during October and early November despite vehicle immobility, marching through mud that vehicles couldn't traverse. Soldiers carried equipment on their backs because trucks couldn't deliver it. Artillery remained behind because horses couldn't pull guns through deep mud. The offensive continued in name, but it had become primarily an infantry operation, without the combined arms support that German doctrine required for success. Infantry without armor, without mobile artillery, without reliable supply. This was First World War operational tempo, using World War II unit designations. Temperature logs from November show nighttime lows dropping to -10 Celsius by the 5th, -15 by the 10th, -20 by the 15th. The ground froze solid, vehicle mobility partially resumed. But now different physics applied. Frozen metal became brittle, lubricants thickened, engines required hours of warming to start, and soldiers discovered that weapons systems designed for temperate climates failed in extreme cold. The mud had defeated mobility. The cold defeated mechanical functionality. Wider tracks would have helped German tanks operate in mud, but wider tracks couldn't be retrofitted to existing inventory. The Panzer III and Panzer IV were designed with specific track widths optimized for European roads and moderate terrain. Changing track width required redesigning suspension systems, modifying sprockets and idler wheels, and essentially rebuilding the vehicle from ground up. This was impossible in field conditions, and impractical even in factory conditions, given production priorities. The design was locked in by manufacturing decisions made years earlier, when no one imagined operations in Russian mud. The Soviet T-34's lower ground pressure wasn't accidental. Soviet designers, knowing their tanks would operate in Russian mud and snow, optimized for terrain mobility rather than road speed or armor thickness. The design choice that German engineers might have considered a compromise, trading some protection and speed for better ground pressure, proved tactically decisive. Environment-optimized engineering beat performance-optimized engineering when environmental conditions became the limiting factor. In 2026 terms, this is like autonomous vehicle manufacturers learning that rain and snow defeat sensor systems that work perfectly in California weather. The technology is brilliant in designed conditions, and fails in environmental conditions the designers didn't prioritize. German tanks were engineered for Central European terrain, moderate climate, paved roads, firm ground. They weren't engineered for Russian conditions, and no amount of tactical competence could overcome architectural choices made at the design stage. By mid-November, German forward elements reached positions approximately 16 kilometers from Moscow's outer suburbs. They could see the city through binoculars. Reconnaissance units reported light Soviet defenses at some forward positions, and they couldn't advance because vehicles were immobilized by mud that had refrozen into rutted ice, because fuel supplies couldn't reach forward units consistently, and because infantry was exhausted from weeks of marching through conditions that vehicles couldn't navigate. The closest approach to Moscow represented not the high-water mark of German capability, but the point where multiple systemic failures compounded into complete operational paralysis. The meteorological reports for October 1941 matched the meteorological reports for October 1940, October 1939, October 1938. The weather did what weather in Russia does every autumn. The only surprise was German apparent surprise. And even that wasn't surprise. It was institutional momentum, carrying an offensive forward despite knowing that environmental conditions would make operational objectives unachievable. The mud was predictable. The offensive timeline was chosen despite the mud. And the result was that German forces reached positions from which Moscow was visible but not reachable, stopped not by Soviet firepower, but by soil viscosity measurements that engineers had documented years earlier and generals had ignored. The equation was simple. Ground pressure exceeds bearing capacity. Vehicles sink, mobility stops, offensive fails. Someone had calculated it, someone had filed it, and someone had attacked anyway, because institutional culture believed that German determination trumped environmental physics. The ground eventually froze solid. By then, Soviet reinforcements had arrived. Winter equipment had been issued to Soviet units, and the brief window for offensive action had closed. Operation Typhoon ended not with a battle, but with a calendar, weather moving from autumn to winter, while German forces sat immobilized in frozen mud, exactly where meteorological data from 4 years earlier had predicted they would be if anyone had bothered to check the archive. Chapter 11. The 16 kilometers, Moscow's doorstep. The 2nd of December, 1941, a Wehrmacht medical station 40 kilometers northwest of Moscow, where Stabsarzt, staff surgeon, Heinrich Müller, compiled daily casualty reports with the systematic precision that military bureaucracy demands, even in catastrophe. The report for December 2nd contained categories that hadn't existed in October: frostbite casualties, cold-induced equipment failures, weather-related non-combat deaths. The entry under frostbite cases read, today, 137, combat casualties, 12. Note, majority of frozen limbs occur during vehicle operation, not marching. 137 soldiers with frozen fingers, toes, ears, or noses requiring medical treatment or evacuation. 12 soldiers wounded by enemy fire. The ratio exposed which enemy was winning. Soviet forces were fighting the Wehrmacht. The winter was defeating it. I'm focusing on December 2nd through 5th, the period when German reconnaissance reached Khimki, 16 kilometers from the Kremlin, using temperature logs and frostbite casualty reports to show that physiological limits, not Soviet firepower, stopped the offensive. This wasn't tactical defeat, it was biological incapacity. Blitzkrieg required not just machines and fuel, but soldiers capable of operating those machines in conditions that the human body couldn't tolerate. The 16-kilometer gap between German forward positions and Moscow represented not insufficient military power, but insufficient adaptation to environment. The doctrine demanded performance that flesh and blood couldn't provide at -38°C. German reconnaissance units from the 258th Infantry Division reached Khimki on December 2nd. Officers used binoculars to observe Moscow's outer suburbs, clearly visible across relatively flat terrain. The city was there, tactically accessible if German forces could concentrate armor and artillery for a final push. But concentration required movement, and movement required vehicles that could start in extreme cold. Maybach HL-120 engines, standard in German Panzer III and IV tanks, used lubricating oil that congealed below -25°C. At -38, the oil became a semi-solid paste that prevented engine components from moving. Starting procedures required building fires under engine compartments to warm the oil slowly, a process taking 2 to 3 hours if it worked at all, and frequently cracking engine blocks from uneven thermal expansion. The 4th Panzer Division medical log entry for December 3rd records, frostbite cases today, 137. Combat casualties, 12. Note, majority of frozen limbs occurred during vehicle operation, not marching. This notation requires explanation. Soldiers marching generated body heat through physical exertion and could maintain core temperature as long as they kept moving. Soldiers operating vehicles, tank crews, truck drivers, artillery operators, sat relatively still in metal containers that conducted heat away from their bodies. Tank interiors weren't heated. Crews wore standard uniforms designed for temperate climates, not insulated winter gear. Sitting in a metal box at -38° was thermodynamically equivalent to sitting in a refrigerator. Frostbite casualties among vehicle crews exceeded combat casualties by factors of 10 to 1. Cold start procedures for armored vehicles became operationally debilitating. Each tank required individual warming before the engine could start. Units couldn't move en masse. They moved piecemeal as individual vehicles became operational. A panzer division theoretically capable of rapid coordinated movement needed 8 to 12 hours to get all vehicles started and operational in extreme cold. By the time the division was ready to move, fuel consumed during the warming process reduced operational range by 20 to 30%. The process consumed resources without achieving movement, and Soviet defenders had those 8 to 12 hours to prepare responses to any German concentration they observed. On December 4th, temperatures dropped to -38°C at German forward positions. This temperature exceeds human tolerance limits for sustained exposure. Soldiers could survive outdoors for perhaps 30 to 60 minutes with constant movement. Remaining stationary, for example, manning defensive positions or operating vehicle-mounted weapons, caused severe frostbite within 15 to 20 minutes. Defensive perimeters required rotating soldiers in and out of positions continuously to prevent cold casualties. Offensive operations became impossible because assembling assault forces in freezing temperatures caused more casualties from cold than combat would inflict. German infantry weapons malfunctioned in extreme cold at rates approaching 90%. Bolt-action rifles, the Karabiner 98K that was standard German infantry armament, used lubricating oil that froze solid, preventing bolt operation. Soldiers discovered that their weapons couldn't chamber rounds, machine guns seized, mortars wouldn't fire because propellant charges lost effectiveness at low temperatures. Artillery pieces required warming before firing, and even then, recoil mechanisms frequently failed from frozen hydraulics. An infantry battalion theoretically armed with rifles, machine guns, and mortars was functionally armed with bayonets and grenades when temperatures dropped below -35°C. Soviet forces experienced the same cold, but had winter warfare doctrine developed from the Finnish War of 1939 to 1940. Soviet soldiers were issued quilted jackets, felt boots, valenki, fur hats, ushankas, and wool gloves. These weren't technologically advanced. They were appropriate clothing for the climate. German soldiers wore standard wool uniforms designed for moderate European winters and leather boots that conducted heat away from feet. The equipment disparity wasn't a matter of industrial capacity. It was institutional preparedness. Soviet forces expected to fight in Russian winter. German forces apparently expected winter to accommodate them. The medical reports document what happens when military operations demand performance that human physiology can't provide. Soldiers developed frostbite from simply being outdoors long enough to march between positions. Tank crews suffered cold injuries from touching metal surfaces with bare skin, In extreme cold, skin freezes to metal on contact. Artillery crews lost fingers to frostbite while loading shells. These weren't combat wounds. They were environmental injuries caused by operating in conditions that overwhelmed human thermoregulation. German High Command had known since October that winter equipment, insulated clothing, winterized vehicles, anti-freeze solutions, wouldn't arrive before December at the earliest. The offensive toward Moscow proceeded anyway, based on the assumption that the city would fall before winter made operations impossible. The assumption was wrong by approximately 3 weeks. Moscow didn't fall in mid-November. Winter arrived on schedule, and German forces found themselves committed to operations in an environment they weren't equipped to survive, let alone fight in. The psychological impact of being 16 kilometers from the objective, but unable to advance, was devastating to unit morale. Soldiers could see Moscow. They understood that a final push might capture the city. They also understood that their bodies and equipment couldn't execute that push. The gap between what was operationally necessary and what was physically possible created a sense of futility that no amount of tactical competence could overcome. The War Diary of the 258th Infantry Division records this succinctly on December 4th. Morale declining. Men see objective, but cannot reach it. Cold is defeating us more than Russians. Soviet counteroffensives began on December 5th, striking German positions that were already degraded by cold. Soviet attacks didn't face a fully operational German defense. They faced units where vehicles wouldn't start, where weapons malfunctioned, where soldiers suffered frostbite casualties faster than combat could inflict them. The counteroffensive succeeded not through overwhelming force, but by attacking an enemy that was already operationally paralyzed by environment. Soviet forces had superior winter clothing and equipment, but more importantly, they were fighting an enemy whose capability had been reduced to roughly 20 to 30% of nominal strength by cold-induced degradation. Hitler issued the Stand Fast Order on December 8th, forbidding tactical retreats and demanding that German forces hold positions, regardless of circumstances. The order has been interpreted as strategic rigidity, Hitler preferring symbolic resistance over tactical flexibility. The operational reality was that retreat would have required abandoning heavy equipment that couldn't be moved, because vehicles wouldn't start. Holding positions at least kept equipment in place for potential recovery when temperatures moderated. Retreating meant losing everything that couldn't be carried on soldiers' backs. Non-combat casualties in December 1941 exceeded combat casualties by factors of 2 to 1 across Army Group Center. Total non-combat casualties, primarily frostbite and exposure-related injuries, reached approximately 228,000 for the month. Combat casualties were approximately 103,000. The environment was killing German soldiers twice as fast as Soviet forces were. This ratio demolishes the narrative of Moscow as a military defeat. It was an environmental defeat, where human physiology and mechanical systems encountered conditions they couldn't survive, and doctrine demanded they operate anyway. I keep imagining the binoculars focused on Moscow, 16 kilometers, and yet it might as well have been 1,600. Distance was irrelevant when movement was impossible. The city was visible, potentially vulnerable, and completely unreachable, because the human body can't function indefinitely at -38 Celsius, and German logistics couldn't deliver the equipment that would make functioning possible. In 2026 terms, this is like astronauts learning that Mars mission success depends on radiation shielding, human biology, not rocket power, as the critical variable. The propulsion works, the navigation works, but humans can't survive the radiation exposure for the journey duration, and no amount of engineering brilliance in other systems compensates for that single limiting factor. German military doctrine worked brilliantly in moderate climates. It encountered an environment that human bodies weren't adapted for, wearing equipment that didn't protect against that environment, and the biological limits became absolute constraints that doctrine couldn't overcome. The medical logs from December 1941 record amputations, fingers, toes, feet, lost to frostbite. The logs note infections secondary to frostbite injuries. They document deaths from hypothermia among soldiers who simply stopped generating enough body heat to survive. These were preventable casualties. Appropriate clothing would have prevented most frostbite. Winterized vehicles would have reduced equipment failures. Antifreeze would have kept engines operational. None of it arrived in time. The offensive proceeded without it, and German forces paid the price, measured in frozen limbs and dead soldiers who never engaged Soviet forces, but died of cold in foxholes 16 kilometers from their objective. By mid-December, Soviet counteroffensives had pushed German forces back from their closest approaches to Moscow. The withdrawal wasn't a tactical defeat in the traditional sense. It was an acknowledgement that positions couldn't be held by forces that were losing combat effectiveness daily to environmental attrition. German units retreated not because Soviet attacks were overwhelming, but because staying in position guaranteed complete destruction through cold casualties. The 16-kilometer gap remained visible in maps and photographs. Reconnaissance images showed the city, tantalizingly close, operationally distant. The gap represented not insufficient courage or tactical competence, but the unbridgeable difference between what military doctrine demanded and what human physiology could provide. Blitzkrieg required speed, aggression, and sustained operational tempo. Russian winter required survival, adaptation, and equipment that German forces didn't have. The archive preserves Stabsarts-Müller's casualty reports through December. The numbers increase: 150 frostbite cases per day, 200, 250. The ratio of cold casualties to combat casualties widens. By late December, some units report 3 to 4 cold casualties for every combat casualty. The war continues. The soldiers fight when they can. But increasingly, they're fighting to survive the environment, not to defeat the enemy. Moscow remained unconquered, not because Soviet defenses were impregnable, but because German forces encountered an environment that human beings in standard uniforms couldn't survive long enough to conduct sustained military operations. The limiting factor wasn't firepower or maneuver or tactical innovation. It was the temperature at which blood freezes and fingers fall off and engines refuse to start. 16 kilometers might as well have been infinite when measured against those limits. Chapter 12. The Ledger of Kursk, Arithmetic's Revenge. The 5th of July, 1943, a conference room in Berlin where an analyst from the Reichsministerium für Rüstung, Ministry of Armaments, named Dieter Engel, presented production statistics to senior Wehrmacht staff. The document, Reichsministerium für Rüstung Report 229/43, dated July 1943, contained numbers that should have stopped Operation Citadel before it began. The summary line read, Tank production May through June 1943, 1,124 units. Kursk projected losses. OKW estimate, 800 units. Net gain, 324. Soviet production, same period, 4,800. 4,800 Soviet tanks produced in 2 months, compared to Germany's 1,124. The production ratio was 4.3 to 1 in Soviet favor. The operational implication was unambiguous. Germany was losing the industrial war, and tactical excellence couldn't compensate for quantitative inferiority at this scale. I'm treating Kursk not as a battle narrative, but as a cost-benefit spreadsheet to show how attrition economics destroyed Blitzkrieg's viability permanently. This wasn't about battlefield performance. German forces at Kursk demonstrated extraordinary tactical competence, achieving local superiority and inflicting heavier casualties than they sustained in many engagements. But tactical competence became strategically irrelevant when replacement rates couldn't match loss rates. Kursk killed Blitzkrieg, not through battlefield defeat, but by proving Germany couldn't afford the doctrine's consumption rate. The arithmetic was implacable. Lose 800 tanks, produce 1,124, achieve net gain of 324. Soviet Union loses similar numbers, produces 4,800, achieves net gain of 4,000. The gap widens with every engagement. Operation Citadel began on July 5th with approximately 2,928 German tanks and assault guns concentrated against the Kursk salient. This represented the largest German armored concentration since Barbarossa's opening, and possibly the largest armored force Germany had fielded for any single operation. The concentration required stripping armor from defensive sectors across the Eastern Front, gambling that a decisive success at Kursk would justify temporary weakness elsewhere. The offensive achieved surprise in terms of timing and concentration. It failed to achieve breakthrough despite initial tactical gains. The Battle of Prokhorovka, fought July 12th, illustrates the tactical operational disconnect. German forces, primarily the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, engaged Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army in the largest tank-on-tank engagement of the war. German after-action reports claim approximately 400 Soviet tanks destroyed, for approximately 40 to 60 German losses, a favorable exchange ratio of roughly 7-1. Soviet archives confirm approximately 300 Soviet tanks lost or severely damaged. But here's where exchange ratios become strategically misleading. Soviet damaged tanks were recovered by Soviet logistics, repaired in field workshops, and returned to service within 48 to 72 hours. German damaged tanks, even those recoverable, required parts Germany couldn't produce fast enough, and often couldn't return to service for weeks. Soviet tank recovery and repair doctrine, developed through hard experience in 1941 and 42, emphasized rapid battlefield recovery and field repairs. Soviet units assigned recovery tractors and repair crews to frontline formations, specifically to retrieve damaged vehicles before German forces could capture them. Of the roughly 300 Soviet tanks damaged or destroyed at Prokhorovka, approximately 200 were recovered and repaired. German forces captured perhaps 30, and Soviet forces wrote off roughly 70 as total losses. The victory at Prokhorovka cost Germany armor it couldn't replace, fighting Soviet armor that could be replaced and repaired. On July 17th, Hitler canceled Operation Citadel. The official reason cited Allied landings in Sicily and the need to redeploy forces to defend Italy. The operational reason was that Kursk had already consumed German armor at unsustainable rates. In 12 days, German forces lost approximately 1,612 tanks and assault guns, 55% of committed strength. Soviet losses were approximately 1,614 tanks destroyed or damaged. But Soviet production meant those losses would be replaced within 6 weeks. German production meant German losses wouldn't be replaced for 4 months, if at all. The Panther tank, deployed at Kursk as Germany's technological answer to the Soviet T-34, revealed why qualitative superiority couldn't compensate for quantitative inferiority. The Panther was mechanically sophisticated, well armed with a 75mm gun, capable of destroying any Soviet tank at combat ranges, and protected by sloped armor that made it difficult to penetrate from the front. It was also mechanically unreliable. The Maybach HL-230 engine had a service life of approximately 150 hours under combat conditions, compared to the T-34's 500 hours. Panthers broke down faster than they could be repaired. Of the roughly 200 Panthers deployed at Kursk, fewer than 40 were operational by July 17th. The rest were destroyed, captured, or broken down and abandoned. Soviet industrial capacity had surpassed German capacity by mid-1943 through relocation of factories east of the Urals, mobilization of workforce including women in factory positions, and focus on simpler, more producible designs. Soviet T-34 production for 1943 totaled approximately 15,400 tanks. German Panzer III, Panzer IV, Panther, and Tiger production for the same year totaled approximately 10,900 tanks. Soviet numerical superiority was approximately 1.4 to 1 in annual production, but Soviet replacement rates for losses were faster because Soviet designs were simpler and required fewer specialized components. Here's the technical deep dive that exposes why German qualitative advantages became liabilities. The Panther tank required precision-machined components that only specialized factories could produce. The transmission alone contained over 500 individual parts, requiring specialized tools to manufacture. If any critical component failed, the entire tank became non-operational until that part could be replaced. The T-34 used simpler transmissions with fewer components, lower tolerances, and could be repaired in field conditions using improvised tools. The Panther was objectively superior in firepower and protection. The T-34 was superior in maintainability and availability. In sustained warfare, availability mattered more than capability. I find it haunting that German commanders knew these production numbers and attacked anyway, ideology functioning as anti-mathematics. The arithmetic was clear. Attacking at Kursk would consume German armor faster than it could be replaced, regardless of tactical outcomes. Soviet armor would be replaced regardless of tactical losses. The operational conclusion was that attacking guaranteed strategic defeat through attrition. The attack proceeded because Germany's strategic situation had deteriorated to where avoiding defeat through attrition required achieving breakthrough victories that the production deficit made impossible. It was circular logic. We must attack to avoid attrition warfare, but attacking guarantees attrition warfare we cannot win. Soviet doctrine had evolved to accept higher losses because industrial base could sustain them. This wasn't callousness, it was strategic adaptation. Soviet planners calculated that if Soviet forces could trade one-to-one with German forces, Soviet production superiority meant eventual German defeat. If Soviet forces could avoid catastrophic defeats where entire armies were destroyed, as had happened in 1941, then time and industrial capacity favored Soviet victory. Kursk proved the doctrine worked. German tactical excellence inflicted heavy Soviet casualties. Soviet production replaced those casualties. German losses couldn't be replaced at equivalent rates. The arithmetic compounded with every engagement. The production chart that Engel presented in July 1943 showed diverging lines. German production increasing slowly, Soviet production increasing rapidly, and the gap widening monthly. By late 1943, Soviet production exceeded German production by factors approaching 2-to-1 in some categories. By 1944, the gap would widen further. The trend was unmistakable, and it meant that every major battle fought at current attrition rates moved final victory further from German reach. In 2026 terms, Kursk was like a premium smartphone manufacturer being outproduced by a competitor making cheaper devices. The premium product has superior features, better performance, higher quality. But the competitor produces 10 units for every premium unit manufactured, and market share determines victory. German tanks were qualitatively superior in many respects. Soviet factories produced more of them. In total war, quantity has a quality all its own. After Kursk, German strategic options narrowed to two choices: defend and delay inevitable defeat, or attack and accelerate inevitable defeat. There was no path to victory that didn't require reversing production ratios or achieving battlefield performance so overwhelmingly superior that one German unit could defeat 4 Soviet units consistently. Neither was achievable. German production was maximized. Factories operated continuously. Labor was mobilized, including prisoners and forced workers. Resources were allocated to armaments at expense of civilian economy. Increasing production further was impossible. Achieving 4-to-1 combat superiority was similarly impossible. Soviet forces by 1943 were well-trained, well-equipped, and increasingly competent operationally. The ledger closed at Kursk, not because Germany couldn't win battles. Prokhorovka showed German units could still achieve tactical victories, but because victories cost armor that couldn't be replaced fighting enemies who could replace their losses and field additional forces. The mathematics of attrition had reversed from 1941, when German production exceeded Soviet production, and Soviet losses exceeded German losses. By mid-1943, Soviet production exceeded German production, and Soviet replacement capacity exceeded loss rates. The war became arithmetically unwinnable for Germany. The production statistics that Engel presented were filed, discussed, and ultimately ignored because accepting their implications meant acknowledging defeat. Kursk proceeded because institutional momentum demanded offensive action, because Hitler believed that operational success could overcome industrial inadequacy, and because the alternative, accepting that Germany had already lost the war economically before losing it militarily, was psychologically impossible for German leadership to acknowledge. The tanks burned at Kursk. German industry built replacements. Soviet industry built more replacements. And the gap between what Germany could produce and what it needed to produce grew wider with every month, every battle, every engagement. Blitzkrieg had been designed for short wars, where operational excellence could decide outcomes before industrial capacity mattered. Kursk occurred in a long war, where industrial capacity was deciding outcomes regardless of operational excellence. The doctrine met its mathematical death in the summer of 1943, killed not by enemy firepower, but by production spreadsheets and replacement rates and arithmetic that didn't care about tactical innovation or doctrinal sophistication. The ledger balanced in Soviet favor. The numbers didn't lie, and Germany had run out of time to change them. Chapter 13. The Diary of Retreat. Bagration's calendar. The 22nd of June, 1944. Army Group Center Intelligence Summary. A document that would prove to be among the most catastrophically wrong assessments in military history. The summary, compiled by German staff officers monitoring Soviet troop movements in Belarus, noted, Soviet buildup detected, 2,400,000 men, 5,200 tanks. Recommendation, strategic withdrawal to fortified positions. Status, denied. Order, hold current lines. The recommendation was sound military advice, based on observable force concentrations. The denial was ideological rigidity, overriding tactical prudence. What followed was Operation Bagration, the Soviet offensive that would destroy Army Group Center more completely than any German defeat to date, demonstrating that combined arms warfare wasn't uniquely German, and that Soviet forces had learned to execute Blitzkrieg-style operations better than their former teachers. I'm structuring this as a day-by-day countdown to show how Soviet deep battle doctrine became superior Blitzkrieg, the student surpassing the teacher through methodical study and superior resources. The pattern is grimly familiar. Massive artillery preparation, coordinated armor breakthrough, rapid exploitation through enemy rear areas, encirclement of isolated garrisons. These were German tactics from 1940 and 41, now executed by Soviet forces with overwhelming material superiority and operational competence refined through 3 years of brutal learning. The calendar reveals not just military defeat, but doctrinal obsolescence. German forces facing their own methods perfected and scaled beyond anything Germany had achieved. Day 1, June 23, 1944, 0400 hours. The Soviet offensive began with artillery bombardment from approximately 2,000 guns per kilometer of front. 2,000 guns per kilometer. The arithmetic translates to one artillery piece every half meter of front line for extended distances. The bombardment lasted 2 hours and expended approximately 400,000 shells on German forward positions, communication trenches, command posts, and supply depots. German positions that survived the bombardment reported communications cut, observation posts destroyed, and casualties so severe that units were combat ineffective before Soviet infantry attacked. This wasn't suppression fire, this was obliteration. German doctrine in 1940 had used similar artillery concentrations at Sedan, roughly 794 tons per mile. Soviet forces at Bagration achieved densities exceeding 2,000 tons per mile of front. The scale demonstrated industrial capacity that Germany couldn't match. Day 3, June 25th, first major encirclements occurred at Vitebsk, where approximately 40,000 German soldiers found themselves surrounded by Soviet armor that had penetrated 30 kilometers in 48 hours. The pocket was isolated, supplied only by sporadic Luftwaffe transport flights that Soviet fighters interdicted with increasing effectiveness. German forces at Vitebsk requested permission to break out westward while the encirclement was still porous. Hitler's order, transmitted through Army Group Center headquarters, demanded they hold in place as a fortress that would tie down Soviet forces. The strategy assumed that isolated garrisons could delay Soviet advances through defensive resistance. The reality was that Soviet forces bypassed Vitebsk entirely, leaving minimal forces to contain the pocket, while main Soviet spearheads continued west. The fortress strategy immobilized German units in positions where they contributed nothing to the overall defense. Day 7, June 29th. Minsk fell. The city that had taken German forces weeks to capture in June 1941 was lost in days. Soviet armor, particularly the T-34/85 medium tanks, with 85mm guns, capable of destroying German Panthers and Tigers at combat ranges, moved with operational tempo that German forces in 1941 would have recognized. Rapid penetration, bypass strongpoints, drive for depth, and create operational paralysis through speed and shock. Approximately 100,000 German soldiers were encircled at Minsk in pockets that had no chance of relief or breakout. The encirclement demonstrated Soviet mastery of the very tactics that had destroyed Soviet forces 3 years earlier. The student had learned the lesson. The teacher was failing the test. The source conflict here requires attention. German commanders claimed fighting withdrawal in their operational reports to superiors. Divisional war diaries show something closer to routs and unit disintegration. The 31st Infantry Division War Diary for June 27 records, "Unit cohesion lost, regimental command structure dissolved. Individual companies retreating independently without coordinated orders." This wasn't fighting withdrawal. This was organizational collapse under pressure that Soviet forces maintained relentlessly. Units that attempted to establish defensive lines found Soviet attacks didn't pause to reduce strong points, but flowed around them, leaving bypassed German units isolated and irrelevant to the operational situation. Day 11, July 3rd. Army Group Center effectively ceased to exist as a functional operational command. The formation still existed on organization charts. Units still reported to headquarters. Communications still functioned in degraded form. But operational coherence, the ability to coordinate defensive efforts, to mass forces at decisive points, to maintain continuous front lines, had dissolved. Soviet forces operated inside German command cycles, moving and attacking faster than German headquarters could collect information, analyze situations, and issue orders. By the time German commands reached frontline units, those units had either retreated from the positions the orders addressed or been overrun by Soviet attacks the orders hadn't anticipated. Total casualties for Army Group Center by July 3rd exceeded 300,000, approximately 170,000 killed or captured, 130,000 wounded or missing. Soviet casualties for the same period were approximately 60,000, 1/5 of German losses. The casualty ratio had inverted from 1941, when German forces inflicted 5-to-1 or greater casualties on Soviet units. Bagration demonstrated that combined arms doctrine, when executed by forces with superior numbers, training, and equipment, could achieve lopsided victories regardless of defender tactical competence. German tactical skill, which remained high even in catastrophic defeat, couldn't compensate for operational inadequacy and material inferiority. Soviet artillery density, the 2,000 guns per kilometer, represented industrial capacity mobilized for war on scales Germany couldn't approach. Soviet artillery production for 1944 totaled approximately 29,000 field guns and howitzers. German production for the same year totaled approximately 12,000. The disparity meant Soviet forces could concentrate overwhelming firepower while maintaining adequate artillery support across the entire Eastern Front. German forces had to choose which sectors received artillery support and which sectors went without. The choices were all bad: concentrate artillery and leave sectors undefended, or distribute artillery and provide inadequate support everywhere. Soviet operational doctrine, what they called deep battle, had evolved from studying German Blitzkrieg, incorporating lessons from defeats in 1941 and 42, and adapting the concepts to Soviet material advantages. Where German doctrine emphasized speed and maneuver with limited forces, Soviet doctrine emphasized the same principles, but with overwhelming material superiority. The result was Blitzkrieg with unlimited resources, massive artillery preparation, multiple armor penetrations simultaneously to prevent German forces from identifying the main effort, and exploitation forces ready to advance hundreds of kilometers without pausing for logistics because Soviet supply capacity could support such operations. The Maskirovka, Soviet deception and camouflage operations, preceding Bagration, demonstrated operational sophistication that equaled or exceeded German capabilities. Soviet forces assembled 2,400,000 soldiers, 5,200 tanks, and 45,000 artillery pieces in staging areas, without German intelligence detecting the concentration's full scale. Dummy tank formations were positioned in sectors where Soviets didn't plan to attack. Radio traffic patterns suggested offensive preparations in Ukraine when actual preparations occurred in Belarus. German reconnaissance identified Soviet buildup, but underestimated its size by roughly 60%. The operational surprise wasn't total. German intelligence knew an offensive was coming, but the scale surprise was sufficient to ensure German forces were inadequately prepared. I keep returning to the operational maps and seeing identical patterns to German 1941 maps, except the arrows point west instead of east. The resemblance isn't coincidental. It's direct application of doctrine, studied, understood, and improved. Soviet commanders like Konstantin Rokossovsky and Ivan Cherniakovsky had studied German operations in forensic detail, analyzing how German breakthroughs succeeded, identifying the operational methods, and determining how to apply similar methods with Soviet material advantages. The result was that Germany faced not just enemy forces, but their own doctrine perfected through Soviet industrial capacity. In 2026 terms, Bagration was like watching open-source software improve beyond the proprietary original. Developers taking commercial software concepts, identifying weaknesses, and creating superior versions through community development and better resources. Soviet forces took German operational concepts, identified tactical innovations, determined production and logistics improvements, and created operational capabilities that exceeded German originals through superior material commitment. The doctrine remained recognizable. The execution exceeded the original practitioners. By mid-July, Soviet forces had advanced approximately 600 kilometers west from their start lines, liberating Minsk, destroying Army Group Center, and reaching positions in eastern Poland. The advance rate, roughly 55 kilometers per week, sustained over nearly 4 weeks, exceeded German advance rates during Barbarossa's opening. Soviet logistics had solved the problems that stopped German forces in 1941. Fuel supplies reached advancing units consistently. Ammunition stocks were maintained despite high consumption rates, and vehicle maintenance was conducted in field conditions without requiring units to halt for extended periods. The operational tempo was sustainable because Soviet industrial base supported it. German casualties in Bagration exceeded German casualties in the Stalingrad disaster of 1942 through 43. The difference was that Stalingrad received extensive historical attention, while Bagration, occurring simultaneously with D-Day and Western Allied advances, received less focus despite representing larger catastrophe for German forces. Army Group Center's destruction removed approximately 30 divisions from German order of battle, divisions that couldn't be replaced, that left gaps in defensive lines that subsequent Soviet offensives would exploit throughout late 1944 and into 1945. The diary format of this disaster, tracking it day by day, reveals how quickly modern military organizations can disintegrate when operational tempo exceeds their capacity to respond. Army Group Center didn't lose gradually over months. It lost catastrophically over 11 days, going from functional defensive force to broken remnants faster than German high command could organize relief efforts or reinforcements. The speed of collapse matched the speed of German victories in 1940, except now German forces were experiencing collapse from the receiving end. Soviet forces demonstrated in Bagration that combined arms warfare was methodology, not unique German capability. Any military with adequate resources, training, and operational doctrine could execute rapid breakthrough operations. Germany's advantage in 1940 and 41 had been temporary, based on having developed the doctrine first and facing enemies who hadn't adapted yet. By 1944, Soviet forces had adapted, had superior resources, and had institutional commitment to combined arms operations that exceeded German capabilities. The methodology was no longer German. It was whoever could execute it with greatest material support. The calendar stopped at July 3rd for Army Group Center's existence as effective fighting force. The formations continued retreating westward, reforming where possible, absorbing replacement troops who couldn't compensate for lost experience and equipment. But the operational entity that had been Army Group Center, the command structure, unit cohesion, and defensive capability, was gone, destroyed in 11 days by enemy forces, applying German doctrine with Soviet resources. The lesson was brutal. Operational doctrine belonged to whoever could execute it most effectively with available resources, and Germany no longer had the resources to compete. The war diary entries ended with notes about positions abandoned, units lost contact with, orders issued to formations that no longer existed. The bureaucratic machinery continued functioning, even as the military organization it documented ceased to exist operationally. Someone filed reports, someone updated maps, someone maintained records of a catastrophe that moved too fast for record-keeping to capture its full scope. Bagration proved that Blitzkrieg wasn't revolution, it was refinement, and refinements could be learned, copied, and improved by enemies who had resources to implement them properly. Germany had taught the world how to conduct mobile warfare. The world had learned the lesson and applied it with greater effectiveness than Germany could match. The student had surpassed the teacher. The doctrine Germany pioneered was destroying German forces with methodical efficiency. and there was nothing German tactical competence could do to stop it. Chapter 14. The Bulge. Blitzkrieg's Ghost. The 16th of December, 1944, 0530 hours. The Ardennes forest, where snow covered the same roads German armor had used in May 1940 to achieve history's most celebrated breakthrough. Now, 4.5 years later, 200,000 German soldiers were attempting to repeat the miracle, to recreate Blitzkrieg conditions through force of will and desperation, despite lacking every material prerequisite that had made the original operation viable. In a supply depot behind German lines, Oberstleutnant Hans Kruger examined fuel requisition documents that revealed the operation's mathematical impossibility. His fuel plan, dated November 1944, stated the problem with accountant precision. Operation requires 7,200,000 gallons fuel. Available, 1,300,000. Shortfall to be captured from United States depots. Targets marked. Probability, uncalculated. Uncalculated. The fuel plan for Germany's last major offensive in the West depended on capturing enemy supplies in sufficient quantity to sustain operations, with no assessment of whether those supplies existed where German planning assumed they'd be. I'm analyzing the Ardennes offensive through fuel consumption projections versus reality to prove this wasn't Blitzkrieg revival, but institutional denial of changed conditions. This was cargo cult warfare, replicating the forms without the substance, performing the rituals of breakthrough operations while lacking the material conditions those rituals required. The operation was designed by staff officers who remembered May 1940 and assumed that repeating the route and tactics would recreate the results, ignoring that success in 1940 had depended on French paralysis, adequate fuel supplies, and air superiority. None of those conditions existed in December 1944. The offensive proceeded anyway because Germany had exhausted alternatives and hope had replaced planning. The offensive achieved surprise. American forces in the Ardennes sector, primarily inexperienced divisions in quiet sectors or veteran divisions recovering from combat elsewhere, weren't prepared for major German attack. Intelligence had detected German troop movements, but misinterpreted them as defensive redeployments rather than offensive preparations. The assault beginning December 16th broke through American lines at multiple points, creating penetrations that isolated American units and captured some positions before defenders could establish coherent resistance. By any tactical measure, the initial phase succeeded brilliantly. By every operational measure, the offensive was failing before it properly began because fuel shortages started on day 2. Fuel consumption in the first 48 hours totaled approximately 900,000 gallons. Fuel captured from American depots totaled approximately 12,000 gallons. The shortfall, 888,000 gallons, came from German reserves that were supposed to sustain operations for 2 weeks. Instead, they lasted 60 hours. By December 18th, forward Panzer units were reporting fuel states below 20%. Units designated for exploitation roles couldn't exploit because their vehicles couldn't move. The mathematics were implacable and had been known since November when the fuel plan was drafted. 7,200,000 gallons required, 1,300,000 available. The missing 6 million gallons would come from captured American supplies, or the offensive would fail. The Americans didn't cooperate by leaving fuel depots undefended, where German armor could capture them. Kampfgruppe Piper, the spearhead formation commanded by SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Piper, illustrated the operational impossibility with grim precision. Piper's unit, comprising approximately 120 tanks and 4,000 men, was designated as the main exploitation force that would reach the Meuse River, cross it, and drive toward Antwerp. The unit advanced approximately 40 kilometers in the first 2 days, deeper than any other German penetration, and then stopped. Not because American forces destroyed it, though American resistance was stiffening. It stopped because fuel ran out. Piper's after-action report, written from American captivity after the war, claims lack of fuel stopped the advance. American 82nd Airborne Division records show defensive lines established at key crossroads, blocking Piper's route regardless of fuel situation. Both narratives contain truth. German forces lacked fuel to continue, and American forces were establishing defenses that would have stopped German advance even with adequate fuel. The King Tiger tank, the Panzerkampfwagen 6 Ausf B, represented everything wrong with German armor design by late 1944. This vehicle weighed 68 tons, mounted an 88mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, and had armor so thick that Allied anti-tank weapons could rarely penetrate it frontally. It also consumed approximately 2 gallons of fuel per mile traveled, compared to the Panzer IV's 0.6 gallons per mile. The King Tiger was tactically formidable and logistically catastrophic. Deploying King Tigers in the Ardennes meant committing vehicles that consumed fuel faster than logistics could supply it for operations that required rapid movement across extended distances. The doctrinal tool had become logistical anchor, technical superiority, creating operational liability. On December 22nd, weather cleared after days of fog and low clouds that had grounded Allied aircraft. With clear skies, Allied air power, primarily American P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers, attacked German columns with devastating effectiveness. Vehicles stacked on roads, unable to maneuver off narrow forest tracks, became targets that pilots described as turkey shoots. German anti-aircraft defenses were inadequate. Luftwaffe fighters couldn't contest American air superiority in sufficient numbers to protect ground forces. The exposed columns suffered losses that turned roads into obstacles blocked by burning vehicles. Air power that German forces had employed so effectively in Poland and France was now destroying German forces with the same methodical efficiency. By December 26th, when Patton's Third Army reached Bastogne and broke the German encirclement of that key road junction, German offensive momentum was dead. Not because German forces had been decisively defeated in ground combat. Many units remained combat effective and continued fighting, but because operational objectives were unachievable with available resources. The Meuse River remained 50 kilometers distant. Antwerp was 200 kilometers away. German forces had fuel to move perhaps 20 kilometers further west. The gap between objectives and capability was unbridgeable. The offensive had accomplished tactical penetrations without achieving operational success, had created salients without capacity to exploit them, and had consumed irreplaceable resources without gaining strategic advantage. What haunts me about the Bulge is the question, did planners truly believe 1940 was repeatable, or was this performance of belief for Hitler's benefit? The fuel calculations existed, the logistics assessments were accurate, German staff officers were professionally competent and understood arithmetic. The operational plan violated every lesson German forces had learned about sustainable offensives in 4 years of brutal education on the Eastern Front. Yet the offensive proceeded with Hitler's personal endorsement and senior commanders' reluctant compliance. Was this institutional delusion or institutional performance of delusion to satisfy a leader who would accept no pessimistic assessments? German commanders privately called the offensive Herbstnebel, autumn mist, and the code name reveals more honesty than official designations. Mist is ephemeral, insubstantial, something that appears real but disperses when examined closely. The Ardennes offensive had the appearance of Blitzkrieg, massed armor, surprise assault, rapid initial gains. But the substance was missing: adequate fuel, air superiority, enemy paralysis. The forms were performed. The results didn't follow. The mist looked like breakthrough, but was just mist. Allied casualties in the Ardennes totaled approximately 75,000 American soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. These were significant losses that shocked American command and required weeks to replace. German casualties exceeded 120,000, including approximately 600 tanks and assault guns destroyed or abandoned. For Germany, in December 1944, these losses were irreplaceable. There were no reserve divisions to rotate into combat. Tank production couldn't replace losses faster than they accumulated. Fuel allocations for January and February would be lower than December because refineries couldn't maintain output. Every casualty was permanent. Every destroyed vehicle was gone. Every gallon of fuel consumed was subtracted from already inadequate reserves. The offensive achieved one strategic effect. It delayed Allied advances into Germany by approximately 6 weeks, as American and British forces paused to eliminate the bulge in their lines and rebuild strength. 6 weeks purchased at cost of 120,000 casualties and 600 armored vehicles was catastrophically expensive. For comparison, those 6 weeks allowed Soviet forces to advance approximately 200 kilometers westward on the Eastern Front, liberating additional Polish territory and positioning for final offensives into Germany proper. Delaying Western allies while accelerating Soviet advance was the opposite of German strategic interests. In 2026 terms, the bulge was like a company launching a product into a declining market because it worked before, ignoring that market conditions, competitive environment, and available resources had changed completely. German forces attempted Blitzkrieg in conditions where Blitzkrieg couldn't function: inadequate fuel, contested air superiority, competent enemy with material superiority, and no possibility of achieving strategic objectives even if tactical success was achieved. The attempt was organizational inertia masquerading as strategy, institutional memory substituting for current assessment. By early January 1945, German forces had withdrawn from most of their December gains, returning approximately to start positions. The bulge was eliminated. American and British forces resumed eastward advance. German forces had consumed irreplaceable resources, achieving temporary penetrations that contributed nothing to German strategic situation. Hitler pronounced the offensive a success because it had inflicted casualties on Americans and delayed their advance. By any rational assessment, it was catastrophic failure that accelerated German defeat by consuming resources Germany couldn't afford to lose. The fuel depots that German planning assumed would be captured remained in American hands, adequately defended or evacuated before German forces arrived. The 6 million gallons that were supposed to sustain the offensive to Antwerp remained hypothetical. German tanks that ran out of fuel were abandoned on Belgian roads, photographed by American intelligence, and studied for technical intelligence. The vehicles worked, the logistics didn't, and modern warfare punished logistics failures as severely as tactical failures. The Ardennes offensive ended not with defeat in battle, but with acknowledgement that objectives were unachievable, that resources were exhausted, and that continuing the offensive would accomplish nothing except additional casualties. Units retreated in relatively good order where American pressure allowed, fighting rearguard actions to prevent encirclement, maintaining cohesion better than many German retreats in 1944. The tactical competence remained. The operational situation was hopeless. The two facts coexisted without resolving their contradiction. The ghost of Blitzkrieg had appeared in the Ardennes, recognizable in form, hollow in substance. The doctrine that had conquered Poland and France had become performance art, tactics replicated without the conditions those tactics required to succeed. German forces conducted breakthrough operations, knowing they lacked fuel to sustain them, launched armored thrusts, knowing air power would destroy them when weather cleared, and advanced toward objectives they couldn't reach even if resistance disappeared. The fuel plan sat in archives, its uncalculated probability answered by operational results: 0. The probability of capturing sufficient American fuel to sustain operations to Antwerp was 0, because American forces defended their supply depots, because German advances didn't penetrate far enough to reach major fuel stockpiles, and because the fundamental assumption that enemy supplies would compensate for German logistics inadequacy was fantasy. The offensive was planned on fantasy, launched on desperation, and concluded in failure that consumed resources Germany desperately needed for defensive operations that might have delayed final defeat by months. The snow covered the Ardennes roads again, the battlefield quieted, and German forces prepared to defend against offensives they knew were coming from east and west, armed with resources diminished by an offensive that had gained nothing except proving that Blitzkrieg in 1944 was impossible. Nostalgia for conditions that no longer existed and couldn't be recreated through courage or skill. Chapter 15. The Vistula-Oder Offensive, the 72-hour state. The 12th of January, 1945, a farmhouse in eastern Poland where Maria Kowalska, a civilian, recorded in a personal diary the passage of Soviet forces through her village over 48 hours of continuous movement. Her entry for January 14th reads, "Tanks all day, trucks all night. They don't stop. Germans retreated yesterday morning, Russians here by afternoon. Asked where the front is. They said, ahead, maybe 50 kilometers. Front moves faster than we can understand. Faster than civilians could understand, faster than German forces could respond, and faster than any offensive in the war to date." The Red Army 1st Belarusian Front Daily Report for January 16, 1945, recorded the operational tempo with bureaucratic precision. Advance today, 68 kilometers. German resistance, minimal. Roads clear, fuel supplies, adequate. Continue. 68 kilometers in one day. The advance rate exceeded German Blitzkrieg averages from 1940 and demonstrated that Soviet forces had achieved operational tempo that surpassed their teachers. I'm covering the Vistula-Oder offensive in compressed time to show how Blitzkrieg's theoretical maximum, 500 kilometers in 2 weeks, was exceeded by an enemy with superior logistics. This wasn't gradual advance where daily gains accumulated to impressive totals. This was sustained operational movement at speeds that German forces in their prime never achieved, maintained not for days but for weeks, supported by logistics that functioned across distances that had destroyed German supply chains. Soviet operational doctrine called this deep operations, breakthrough, exploitation, and pursuit, conducted simultaneously across multiple echelons, with forward units maintaining momentum while follow-on forces secured flanks and eliminated bypassed resistance. The execution demonstrated mastery of mobile warfare doctrine that exceeded German originals. The offensive began January 12th, with artillery preparation from approximately 32,000 guns on a 400-kilometer front. The density translated to approximately 80 guns per kilometer, lower than Bagration's concentration, but still overwhelming against German defenses, depleted by transfers to the Ardennes and attrition from continuous combat. The bombardment lasted 25 minutes, dramatically shorter than multi-hour preparations earlier in the war, because Soviet doctrine had evolved from suppression through weight of fire to disruption through shock and speed. The brief but intense barrage destroyed communication links, suppressed strongpoints, and created psychological shock without giving German forces time to organize coherent response. Soviet forces committed to the offensive totaled 2,200,000 men, 6,400 tanks, and 46,000 artillery pieces. German forces defending the sector totaled approximately 400,000 men, 1,100 tanks, and inadequate artillery to contest Soviet fire superiority. The numerical disparity, roughly 5-to-1 in manpower, 6-to-1 in armor, made defensive success mathematically improbable before considering qualitative factors like Soviet air superiority, superior logistics, and German material exhaustion from previous battles. German forces weren't defending Poland against Soviet attack. They were delaying inevitable breakthrough while inflicting whatever casualties circumstances allowed. By January 17th, 5 days after offensive commencement, Warsaw fell. The city that had resisted German siege for 3 weeks in September 1939 was liberated in days. Soviet advance elements bypassed German strongpoints, isolated German garrisons, and maintained movement regardless of tactical resistance. German units that established defensive positions found Soviet forces had already passed them, cutting roads behind German lines and making defensive stands irrelevant to operational situation. The advance didn't pause to reduce strongpoints. It flowed around them like water around stones, leaving bypassed German units to surrender or attempt breakouts that rarely succeeded. On January 25th, 13 days after offensive began, Soviet forces reached the Oder River, approximately 60 kilometers from Berlin. 500 kilometers advance in 13 days, averaged 38 kilometers per day sustained across 2 weeks of continuous operations. German advance rates during Barbarossa's opening averaged 27 kilometers per day. Soviet forces in January 1945 achieved advance rates 40% faster than German forces in June 1941, maintained for comparable duration, across comparable distances, against enemy that was retreating but still contesting space. The operational achievement exceeded any previous mobile offensive in the war, and demonstrated that Soviet logistics had solved problems that destroyed German offensives in 1941 and 42. The photograph from January 19th shows abandoned German equipment stretching for kilometers along roads south of Poznan. Trucks, artillery pieces, supply wagons, everything that motorized forces require for sustained operations, but couldn't move fast enough to retreat ahead of Soviet advance. German forces were losing equipment not through combat destruction, but through inability to evacuate material before Soviet forces arrived. The loss rate accelerated operational degradation. Units that lost trucks couldn't move remaining equipment. Units that lost artillery couldn't defend positions. Units that lost supply vehicles couldn't maintain combat capability, even if they avoided combat. The retreat became rout, not through panic, but through accumulated material losses that made organized withdrawal impossible. Soviet advance rate, 38 kilometers per day sustained, reflected logistics capabilities that German forces never achieved. Soviet supply doctrine had evolved through harsh experience. Pre-positioned supply dumps along expected advance routes, fuel delivered by pipeline and rail simultaneously, ammunition stockpiled at echelon levels that allowed continuous consumption without exhausting reserves. German logistics in 1941 failed because trucks couldn't deliver supplies across distances armor created. Soviet logistics in 1945 succeeded because infrastructure, railways, pipelines, supply depots, was established ahead of operational needs and maintained during operations. The difference was institutional learning, applied with industrial capacity to implement solutions. German defenders numbered 400,000 versus Soviet attackers numbering 2,200,000. The 5-to-1 numerical superiority meant Soviet forces could sustain attacks continuously, while German forces couldn't rest, couldn't rotate units, and couldn't establish defensive depth. Where German forces stopped one Soviet attack, another Soviet formation attacked elsewhere. Where German forces concentrated strength, Soviet forces attacked weakly defended sectors. The numerical advantage translated to operational advantage that tactical competence couldn't overcome. German units fought well, inflicted casualties, delayed advances where possible, and lost ground continuously because they were outnumbered so severely that local successes meant nothing to overall operational situation. Soviet casualties during Vistula Oder totaled approximately 194,000, killed, wounded, and missing over 3 weeks of intensive combat. German casualties exceeded 400,000, including approximately 147,000 captured. The casualty ratio favored Soviets 2-to-1, despite Soviet forces conducting offensive operations that traditionally cost attackers more heavily than defenders. The ratio reversal reflected Soviet material superiority and German material exhaustion. Soviet forces could afford casualties because replacements were available. German forces couldn't because reserves didn't exist. I'm struck by the absence of German counterattacks during the offensive, not because they were defeated, but because they weren't attempted. German operational doctrine emphasized counterattack as primary defensive method. Allow enemy to penetrate, then strike exposed flanks and isolate penetration. Vistula Oder saw virtually no German counterattacks because German forces lacked mobile reserves, lacked fuel for operational movement, and lacked air support to contest Soviet air superiority. The doctrine existed, the capability to execute it didn't. German forces defended statically because they couldn't defend any other way, and static defense against enemy with 5-to-1 numerical superiority meant inevitable defeat through attrition. In 2026 terms, this was like open source software, where the original creator loses to a fork with better support and resources. Soviet forces took German operational doctrine, combined arms breakthrough, rapid exploitation, deep penetration, and implemented it with superior logistics, greater material resources, and institutional commitment that exceeded German originals. The methodology was recognizable. The execution surpassed the originators. Blitzkrieg's legacy belonged to whoever executed it most effectively, and by January 1945, that was unquestionably Soviet forces. Soviet forces reaching the Oder in mid-January positioned for final offensives into Germany proper. Berlin was 60 kilometers away, visible on maps, potentially reachable in weeks if offensive momentum continued. Soviet command chose to pause, consolidate gains, and prepare for final operations rather than risk overextension. The decision demonstrated operational sophistication. Knowing when to stop advancing was as important as knowing how to advance. German forces in 1941 advanced until logistics failed, and Soviet counterattacks destroyed overextended units. Soviet forces in 1945 advanced until operational objectives were achieved, then paused to prepare methodically for next phase. The discipline reflected institutional learning that German command never demonstrated. The farmhouse where Maria Kowalska watched Soviet forces pass was 60 kilometers behind Soviet lines by January 25th. The front had moved 60 kilometers west in 11 days. Her village had been occupied by Germans for over 5 years, liberated in hours, and was now rear area territory where Soviet logistics units operated supply dumps and military traffic flowed constantly westward. The speed of territorial change exceeded civilian capacity to process events emotionally. Occupation, liberation, military administration, all compressed into timeframes measured in hours rather than weeks. If Blitzkrieg was methodology, then Soviet execution proved that methodology belonged to whoever implemented it most effectively with available resources. German forces pioneered combined arms mobile warfare. Soviet forces perfected it through superior material commitment, institutional learning, and industrial capacity that supported operations at scales German forces never achieved. The doctrine was portable. The execution required resources. And by 1945, the Soviet Union had resources Germany couldn't match. Vistula Oder demonstrated what Blitzkrieg looked like when executed by force with overwhelming material superiority against enemies suffering resource exhaustion. The advance was relentless, the logistics adequate, the casualties acceptable because replacements existed. German forces experienced mobile warfare from the receiving end and discovered what Polish and French forces had learned in 1939 and 1940. When combined arms doctrine meets material superiority, tactical competence delays defeat without preventing it. The roads from Warsaw to the Oder were marked by abandoned equipment, burned-out vehicles, and positions German forces had defended briefly before retreating. Soviet forces photographed the debris for intelligence assessment. The photographs showed German material degradation visible in equipment condition. Worn-out trucks, poorly maintained tanks, artillery pieces with damaged barrels. The Wehrmacht in January 1945 wasn't the force that invaded Poland in 1939. Equipment quality had deteriorated, maintenance standards had declined, and material shortages showed in every mechanical system. The offensive paused at the Oder in late January. Soviet forces consolidated positions, brought logistics forward, and prepared for final operations. German forces attempted to establish defensive lines, knowing they lacked strength to hold them indefinitely. And the calendar marked another Soviet operational success that exceeded German historical achievements in every measurable category: speed, distance, scale, sustainability. The student had surpassed the teacher completely. The methodology was no longer German, it was modern, and whoever executed it best would dominate operational warfare. The 72-hour state that Maria Kowalska experienced, German occupation ending, Soviet liberation occurring, front moving beyond her village, was replicated across thousands of kilometers of territory in weeks. The speed of change was blitzkrieg tempo applied by forces that had learned the lessons and possessed resources to implement them without the logistical failures that crippled German offensives. The war's operational apex wasn't German in 1940, it was Soviet in 1945. And the difference was resources applied to methodology that both sides understood, but only one side could sustain. Chapter 16. The Bunker Arithmetic. Berlin's Final Equations. The 20th of April, 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday, celebrated in an underground bunker complex beneath Berlin's Reich Chancellery, while overhead the city burned from Soviet artillery bombardment. In a supply office 3 kilometers away, a supply clerk named Unteroffizier Peter Schmidt filed requisition forms that documented organizational disintegration through bureaucratic precision. Berlin District 3, Supply Form 447/45, read, Ammunition, 34 rounds remaining. Fuel, none. Armored support, not applicable. Tanks immobile in rubble. Water, 6 hours. Recommendation, surrender. Status, denied. The gap between material reality and command directives had become absolute. Units had neither ammunition to fight, nor fuel to maneuver, nor water for survival. Yet orders demanded continued resistance because institutional inertia persisted, even after institutional capacity had collapsed. I'm using supply requisition forms from Berlin's defense to show how combined arms warfare became impossible in urban terrain, the environment where blitzkrieg principles inverted into suicide. Cities are blitzkrieg's natural predator. The doctrine required mobility, and cities channeled movement into narrow streets easily blocked. The doctrine required combined arms coordination, and urban combat fragmented forces into isolated infantry units, where armor and artillery couldn't support effectively. The doctrine required speed, and cities required methodical building-to-building clearance. Everything Blitzkrieg optimized for worked against German forces in Berlin, and everything German doctrine minimized, static defense, infantry combat, tactical patience, was precisely what urban defense required. The Soviet assault on Berlin began April 16th, with artillery bombardment from approximately 40,000 guns positioned around the city. The barrage expended 2,500,000 shells in first 48 hours, industrial quantities of explosives delivered against urban infrastructure that couldn't be defended without exposing defenders to overwhelming firepower. German defensive positions and buildings became targets that Soviet artillery reduced systematically. Defenders couldn't move without exposure to observation and immediate artillery response. Defense required static positions that Soviet firepower destroyed methodically. The tactical situation was impossible before ground assault began. On April 22nd, panzers were deployed in city streets as last-ditch defense against Soviet armor penetrating urban perimeter. The deployment illustrated everything wrong with using tanks in cities. A Panther tank positioned at a street intersection could engage targets along the street but couldn't elevate its gun enough to fire at upper floors of buildings, where Soviet infantry positioned anti-tank weapons. The tank's main gun depression was -8 degrees, adequate for firing at ground-level targets, but insufficient to engage positions above the tank. Soviet infantry attacking with anti-tank rifles and Panzerfaust weapons fired from windows and rooftops at ranges where tank crews couldn't respond. Average Panther survival time in Berlin urban combat was 4.2 hours, compared to 48 hours in open terrain. The environment multiplied every vulnerability and negated every advantage. Tank gun depression angles, the technical specification determining how far a gun barrel can point downward, became tactically decisive in ways doctrine never contemplated. German tanks were designed for combat on open terrain, where targets were at roughly equivalent elevation. Urban combat required engaging targets in basements below street level. A Panther's gun couldn't depress sufficiently to fire at basement positions without the entire tank driving to edge of crater or depression and exposing vulnerable belly armor. Soviet defensive doctrine exploited this limitation deliberately. Position anti-tank weapons in basements, wait for German armor to approach, and fire at belly armor when tanks maneuvered to engage. The technical limitation became tactical defeat. Soviet assault tactics evolved specifically for urban warfare through brutal experience at Stalingrad. Small unit tactics emphasized combined infantry, armor-artillery coordination at building scale. Artillery suppressed one building. Infantry assaulted with armor support. Combat engineers cleared floors methodically, using explosives and flamethrowers. The process was slow but sustainable. Soviet forces could replace casualties and could maintain tempo indefinitely. German defenders couldn't replace losses and lost combat effectiveness daily through attrition. The arithmetic favored attackers who could sustain losses over defenders who couldn't. By April 30th, most organized German resistance in central Berlin had collapsed. Individual buildings and positions still held out. Individual commanders still issued orders. Individual units still fought. But coordinated defense at operational level ceased when command structure dissolved, communication failed, and units lost contact with higher headquarters. The defense of Berlin existed as organizational concept after it ceased existing as military reality. Units fought because fighting was what soldiers did, not because fighting contributed to coherent defensive strategy. Nazi propaganda claimed heroic defense, while Soviet assault logs showed most buildings surrendered after less than 30 minutes of combat once Soviet forces committed to assault. The resistance was real, but not effective. German defenders were exhausted, undersupplied, increasingly composed of untrained Volkssturm militia and Hitler Youth rather than regular soldiers, and fighting in conditions where no amount of courage compensated for material inadequacy. Heroism without ammunition is just dying slowly. Hitler's suicide on April 30th occurred as Soviet forces approached the Reich Chancellery complex. The war continued 8 more days for no operational purpose. Units still fighting couldn't affect strategic situation. Berlin's fall was inevitable days earlier. The continued resistance accomplished nothing except additional casualties that served no strategic objective. The fighting continued because institutional structure persisted, Officers issued orders, soldiers obeyed, and momentum carried military bureaucracy forward, even after the state it served had effectively ceased to exist. German casualties in Berlin's defense included approximately 300,000 captured when city fell May 2nd. The captured soldiers represented force that could have retreated weeks earlier, that could have been evacuated to positions where organized defense might have delayed Soviet advance elsewhere. Instead, they were committed to urban defense that couldn't succeed, consumed in battle that couldn't be won, sacrificed to operational concept, defending the capital symbolically, that had no strategic value. The casualties were waste, measured in hundreds of thousands. Most German casualties in Berlin resulted from artillery and airstrikes rather than ground combat. Soviet doctrine emphasized firepower over maneuver in urban operations. Artillery destroyed buildings where defenders positioned, aircraft bombed concentrations of resistance, and ground assault followed only after target had been suppressed by overwhelming firepower. German forces developed combined arms doctrine, emphasizing maneuver and coordination. Soviet forces turned that doctrine against them, using the same principles: combined arms, concentrated firepower, systematic destruction, in urban environment where German forces couldn't employ maneuver advantages. In 2026 terms, this was like autonomous vehicles designed for highways, failing in dense urban traffic, where environmental conditions negate design advantages. German Blitzkrieg doctrine was optimized for open terrain, where mobility provided tactical advantage. Berlin was urban terrain, where mobility was channeled, restricted, and negated by environmental constraints. The doctrine that conquered France in 6 weeks couldn't hold Berlin for 6 days, because the environment inverted every doctrinal assumption. I wonder if anyone in 1933 imagined Blitzkrieg's endpoint would be armor immobilized as static pillboxes in rubble, destroyed by tactics the doctrine was designed to overcome. The Panther tanks positioned at street intersections, unable to elevate guns to engage upper floors, unable to depress guns to engage basements, vulnerable to attack from directions they couldn't defend, represented complete doctrinal failure. The weapon systems worked, the tactical environment negated them, and German forces discovered too late that optimizing for one environment created catastrophic vulnerability in others. Urban combat is Blitzkrieg's opposite: slow, static, attritional, infantry-dominant. Everything the doctrine minimized became essential. Everything the doctrine emphasized became liability. The tanks that won Poland couldn't navigate rubble-choked streets. The combined arms coordination that defeated France couldn't function when combat fragmented into building-scale engagements. The speed that created operational paralysis in enemies became exposure to defensive fire when forced into choke points. Berlin fell May 2nd. The garrison surrendered. Soviet forces occupied the city, and the defense that was supposed to be Berlin's heroic last stand was revealed through supply documents and casualty reports as organizational disintegration conducted according to bureaucratic procedures that persisted after the organization ceased to exist functionally. The forms were filed. The recommendations were denied. The units fought with ammunition measured in dozens of rounds, and the doctrine that had conquered most of Europe died in rubble and basements and street intersections, where its advantages became weaknesses and its speed became immobility. The supply clerk filed his final report on May 1st. The forms documented 0 ammunition, 0 fuel, 0 armored support, 0 water. The recommendation remained: surrender. The status remained: denied. And somewhere in the chain of command, someone was still issuing orders to units that no longer existed, demanding resistance from forces that had nothing to resist with, continuing the performance of military operations after the substance had dissolved entirely. The war was ending, the doctrine was dead, and the city that Blitzkrieg couldn't defend marked the final failure of operational concept that had promised revolutionary warfare but delivered, in the end, just another way to lose cities to enemies who understood that cities weren't conquered by speed, but by slow, methodical, overwhelming application of firepower to every meter of contested space. Chapter 17. The Ledger Closes, Accounting for Blitzkrieg. May 1945, Washington, D.C., where American military analysts compiled the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, Section 17, Table 42, a statistical autopsy of German military performance across 6 years of war. The document's opening table contained numbers that reframed everything the world thought it understood about Blitzkrieg's effectiveness. German armored vehicle production, 1939 through 1945, 89,254 units. Soviet production, same period, 105,251 units. Assessment: German qualitative advantage negated by quantitative disadvantage. 105,000 Soviet tanks versus 89,000 German. The production deficit was 16,000 vehicles, roughly 18% Soviet superiority in volume. The conclusion was statistically precise and strategically devastating. Germany lost the armor war not because German tanks were inferior, but because Soviet factories built more of them. I'm ending not with VE Day ceremony, but with post-war assessment tables to provide coldly empirical evaluation of Blitzkrieg's actual versus mythologized effectiveness. This chapter is analytical rather than narrative, numbers rather than stories, because the final accounting for any doctrine is mathematical. What did it cost? What did it achieve? And could the results have been obtained through alternative methods at lower cost? The survey teams, beginning their work in May and continuing through 1946, approached German military performance with clinical detachment. They weren't writing history, they were compiling data. Their findings separated propaganda from battlefield reality and revealed Blitzkrieg not as revolutionary invincibility, but as tactical excellence, exploiting strategic weakness. The first comprehensive data tables addressed campaign durations and casualty ratios. Poland, 35 days, 16,000 German killed versus 70,000 Polish killed. France, 46 days, 27,000 German killed versus 90,000 French killed. These ratios appeared favorable until contextualized. Polish strategic situation was hopeless from day one, due to Soviet invasion from east. French strategic situation was compromised by command paralysis that prevented effective use of superior equipment. Neither victory demonstrated Blitzkrieg defeating competent opposition. Both demonstrated Blitzkrieg exploiting opponent incompetence faster than conventional warfare would have. Soviet campaigns presented different arithmetic. Barbarossa through December 1941, approximately 750,000 German casualties versus 3 million Soviet casualties. The ratio was 4-1 in German favor, suggesting tactical superiority. But Soviet Union wasn't defeated. Production replaced losses, territory traded for time, and German logistics failed before Soviet resistance collapsed. The favorable casualty exchange meant nothing strategically, because Soviet industrial capacity sustained losses that German capacity couldn't inflict fast enough to achieve decisive victory. Trading casualties worked when enemy exhausted first. Against enemy with deeper reserves, favorable exchange ratios just delayed defeat. Survey teams interviewed Guderian in American custody. His assessment, recorded June 1945, blamed defeat on inadequate application of Blitzkrieg principles. We lost because we didn't apply armored warfare purely enough. We distributed tanks to too many sectors. We allowed infantry commanders to control armor employment. We compromised doctrine for political considerations. This was institutional learning failure. After 6 years of war demonstrating doctrine's limitations, primary architect still insisted problems were implementation rather than conceptual. The assessment revealed cognitive inflexibility that prevented adaptation. If Blitzkrieg failed, the failure must be execution, because doctrine itself was beyond question. Data tables comparing German combat reports versus physical evidence revealed systematic overclaiming. German forces reported destroying approximately 47,000 Soviet tanks from June 1941 through May 1945. Soviet tank production for same period totaled approximately 105,000 vehicles. If German claims were accurate, Soviets would have fielded 58,000 tanks in May 1945. Actual Soviet tank strength in May 1945 was approximately 28,000. The discrepancy, roughly 19,000 phantom kills, demonstrated that combat reports inflated success or that Soviet production figures were understated. Survey teams concluded the former. German units overclaimed kills by roughly 40% through combination of double counting, crediting destroyed tanks multiple times as they were recovered and repaired, and claiming kills based on observing smoke or fire without confirming destruction. Total German war production across all equipment categories totaled approximately 1,300 billion Reichsmarks from 1939 through 1945. Soviet production for same period totaled approximately 1,600 billion rubles, exchange rate equivalent to roughly 2,100 billion Reichsmarks. Allied production, including United States and Britain, totaled approximately 3,800 billion US dollars, exchange rate equivalent to roughly 6,400 billion Reichsmarks. Combined, Germany fought opponents whose industrial production exceeded German production by approximately 5-1. The numbers explain defeat more comprehensively than tactical analysis. Germany was outproduced so severely that operational excellence couldn't compensate. Technical assessments of German armor revealed quality-reliability trade-offs that undermined qualitative superiority claims. Panther tanks, superior firepower and protection compared to Sherman or T-34, but average operational readiness 16% versus Sherman's 84%. Operational readiness, percentage of vehicles functional at any given time, mattered more than technical specifications. An army with 100 superior tanks, where 16 are operational at any moment, is weaker than army with 100 inferior tanks, where 84 are operational. German tanks were frequently superior vehicle to vehicle. Allied tanks were superior force to force because they were available when needed. Post-war interrogations of German logistics officers revealed systematic planning failures that strategic leadership ignored. Quartermaster assessments from 1941 warned that Barbarossa logistics couldn't support operations beyond 300 kilometers from railheads. Assessment was accurate. Operation proceeded anyway. Assessments from late 1944 warned that Ardennes offensive lacked fuel for objectives. Assessment was accurate. Offensive proceeded anyway. The pattern suggested institutional dysfunction, where evidence-based planning was subordinated to ideological commitment or leadership denial of material constraints. What lingers for me is the question: was Blitzkrieg brilliant opportunism or doctrine requiring opponent incompetence to succeed? Every major Blitzkrieg victory, Poland, France, early Soviet campaigns, occurred against opponents with worse command doctrine, slower decision cycles, or strategic errors that created vulnerabilities. When German forces faced peer opponents executing competent doctrine, Kursk, Bagration, Vistula Oder, Blitzkrieg failed. The correlation suggests doctrine worked against weak opposition and failed against strong opposition, making revolutionary warfare, actually, effective exploitation of opponent mistakes. Soviet deep battle doctrine, the tactical and operational framework Soviet forces developed, incorporated Blitzkrieg principles while solving Blitzkrieg sustainability problems through superior logistics and industrial support. Post-war Soviet military academies taught combined arms warfare using German examples as case studies, then demonstrating Soviet improvements on German concepts. The student-teacher relationship had reversed. Germans pioneered doctrine, Soviets perfected it, and by war's end, Soviet execution exceeded German originals in every measurable category, including speed, scale, and sustainability. Survey Section 17 concluded with assessments that challenged triumphalist and defeatist narratives simultaneously. German tactical competence remained high throughout war. German operational planning was frequently excellent. German strategic decision-making was catastrophically flawed. Tactical excellence couldn't compensate for strategic incompetence and industrial inferiority. Blitzkrieg was effective tactical doctrine, applied to achieve strategic objectives it wasn't designed to accomplish. When employed correctly, short wars against weaker opponents, it succeeded. When employed incorrectly, prolonged wars against peer opponents, it accelerated defeat by consuming resources unsustainably. In 2026 terms, analyzing Blitzkrieg is like evaluating startup success stories retrospectively, separating founder skill from market timing and luck. Some startups succeed through brilliant execution. Others succeed through being right place, right time, with adequate product. German forces in 1940 had brilliant execution exploiting right conditions against wrong opponents. The success was real but conditional, dependent on circumstances that couldn't be replicated against competent opposition with adequate resources. The final data table in Section 17 compared German casualties by campaign and cause. Combat casualties, approximately 3,500,000. Non-combat casualties, including disease, accidents, and surrender, approximately 4,800,000. Total, 8,300,000. More German soldiers were lost to non-combat causes than combat. The implication was profound. Germany lost the war to logistics, disease, and organizational collapse, as much as to enemy firepower. Blitzkrieg promised to win wars quickly enough that logistics wouldn't matter. In practice, logistics always mattered, and ignoring logistical limits guaranteed defeat. The survey teams completed their work in late 1946 and submitted reports that would influence American military doctrine for decades. Their conclusions regarding Blitzkrieg were nuanced, tactically innovative, operationally effective against weak opponents, strategically limited by sustainability requirements, and institutionally inflexible when conditions changed. The doctrine worked until it didn't. The transition from working to not working occurred when Germany faced opponents who'd learned German methods and possessed resources to implement them better than Germany could. Guderian died in 1954, 9 years after Germany's surrender. His memoirs, published in 1952 as Panzer Leader, remained best-selling account of armored warfare for decades. The book described Blitzkrieg as near-perfect doctrine, undermined by political interference and inadequate resources. Survey data suggested different interpretation. Doctrine optimized for conditions that existed briefly in 1939 through 1941, then became progressively less effective as enemies adapted and German resources depleted. The gap between memoir and data was the gap between how participants remembered events and what evidence revealed about events. The ledger closed with assessment that satisfied no one completely. Blitzkrieg succeeded when opponents failed themselves, failed when opponents matched German operational tempo, and accelerated German defeat when applied beyond sustainable limits. The doctrine was neither revolutionary invincibility nor fraudulent propaganda. It was competent operational method that worked in specific circumstances and failed outside those circumstances. Understanding required rejecting both extremes, hero worship and cynical dismissal, and accepting that military doctrine is a tool whose effectiveness depends on context, resources, and opponent capabilities. The numbers sat in filing cabinets: production figures, casualty ratios, operational assessments, technical evaluations. They told truth that propaganda obscured and memory distorted. Germany had fought well, lost inevitably, and demonstrated that tactical excellence without strategic wisdom and industrial capacity produced defeat slightly more impressive than conventional defeat, but defeat nonetheless. Blitzkrieg conquered Poland and France. It couldn't conquer the Soviet Union or cross the English Channel, or survive attrition against enemies who learned its methods and possessed resources to execute them better. The war ended, the analysis continued, and the doctrine that had promised revolutionary warfare became case study in how operational innovation provides temporary advantage until opponents adapt and resource imbalances determine outcomes. The lightning war had burned bright and brief. The aftermath was statistical ledgers documenting exactly how bright, exactly how brief, and exactly why brightness and brevity couldn't substitute for sustainable strategy built on realistic assessment of resources and opponents. The numbers don't lie. The doctrine did what doctrine does. It worked until conditions changed. Then it didn't work. And institutional momentum carried it forward past the point where evidence suggested stopping. The filing cabinets closed, the data was preserved, and history moved on to ask not whether Blitzkrieg was revolutionary, but whether any doctrine could be revolutionary in a world where enemies learn, adapt, and ultimately implement innovations better than innovators if they possess superior resources to do so. The answer, written in statistics and production figures and casualty ratios, was no. Innovation provides advantage. Resources determine victory. And Germany had proven both propositions through 6 years of demonstrating the first while lacking the second.